From the mists and forests of the far north, where the sea meets stone and pine groves echo the wind's breath, the story of the Goths begins. In the first centuries of the Common Era, long before they would clash with emperors and shake the pillars of Rome, the ancestors of the Gothic peoples lived upon the rugged coasts and forested heartlands of what is now southern Sweden. Gotland, the stony island rising from the Baltic Sea, stands at the center of this early narrative. It was here, in soil rich with relics and the silence of ancient graves, that archaeologists uncovered the earliest echoes of a people destined to leave a mark on Europe's fate. The graves of Gotland tell stories in stillness, longboats etched in stone, graves lined with rocks in the shapes of ships, and treasures buried beside the bones of chieftains and craftsmen. These burials, dating to the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, show remarkable continuity with those later found far to the south, in the Vistula River basin of what is now Poland. The boat-shaped graves, intricate belt buckles, and distinct ceramic styles found in both regions speak not of isolated communities, but of a people in motion. This movement, slow and generational, was more than mere migration. It was a cultural unfolding, a maritime expansion guided by sails, stars, and stories. The seas were not barriers for the Goths, but bridges. Their ships, shallow-bottomed and strong, allowed them to glide between islands, to trade, and to spread. Coins minted in Rome, glinting silver denarii and worn bronze sestertii, have been found in those northern graves. They whisper of trade routes that reached beyond forest and fjord, linking the far corners of Europe through amber, furs, and metal. Long before the swords and sieges of the 3rd century, the Goths were already connected to a wider world. Their language too bore the weight of time. Gothic belonged to the East Germanic branch of the Indo-European family, and though only fragments remain, most notably in the Bible translation of Ulfilas centuries later, it shares ancient kinship with Old Norse and other Germanic tongues. In words for war, kin, and kingship, the roots are clear. Reichs, meaning ruler, echoes across German and Scandinavian languages. Even place names carry faint traces of their passage. And yet, for all the evidence in potsherds and runes, there is mystery. The Roman historian Jordanes, writing centuries later, spoke of Skansa, a northern island teeming with people, so fertile and full that some were driven to leave. It was from there, he wrote, that a legendary king named Bur led his people in 3 ships across the sea to a new homeland. Was it myth or memory? We cannot say. But the pattern it describes, a migration by sea, seeking new lands under new stars, is echoed in the archaeological record. Thus began the Gothic story, not with conquest, but with quiet movement, ships slicing through Baltic waters, families burying their dead in stone-hulled graves, and hands shaping clay and bronze in forms that would one day travel far beyond their forested shores. In the silence of Gotland's burial fields and the winds that roll over its stony coasts, we still hear the first whispers of a people who, though once unknown, would one day challenge an empire. As the generations passed and ships carved steady paths across the Baltic, the Gothic peoples pressed inland. By the middle of the 1st century AD, their presence had begun to shape the valleys and plains of the Vistula River region, the fertile corridor of what is now northern and central Poland. Here, archaeology gives a new name to their culture, the Wilkark, or more often today, the wheelbark culture. This was no sudden arrival, no conquest by flame and sword. Rather, it was a patient settlement, a quiet transformation of land and life. The Goths brought with them traditions from Gotland and southern Sweden, the stone chip burials, the geometric pottery, the artisan's touch, and mingled them with the local customs of the Balts and earlier Germanic peoples. The Vilkach cemeteries speak volumes. Graves were laid out with care, some in circles, others marked with stones or wooden posts. Cremation and inhumation coexisted, a choice, perhaps, of clan or belief. Weapons, though often absent in the graves themselves, appeared in separate ritual deposits nearby. This puzzled early scholars, but with time, a clearer picture formed. The Gothic dead were honored not merely for their role as warriors, but for the lives they led and the beliefs they held. And those beliefs, while still rooted in Germanic tradition, were already shifting. Among the grave goods, fibulae shaped like birds of prey, glass beads from distant lands, Roman amphorae filled with wine or oil, there is evidence of a people in contact with the vast empire to the south. Trade flowed through these valleys like blood through a body, bringing wealth, ideas, and the stirrings of transformation. The settlements of the Vilkach Goths tell us even more. At sites like Cowaluco and Weklis, longhouses stretched over the earth, some more than 40 meters in length. These were not the dwellings of wandering raiders, but of established communities, of farmers, smiths, and families. The land was plowed with iron tools, livestock moved through wooden pens, artisans shaped silver and bronze into the motifs that would become distinctively Gothic. The society that took root here was one of structure and stratification. Chiefs held power, likely through both blood and battlefield, while assemblies, the thing, met to deliberate justice and law. There was a rhythm to Gothic life now, one in tune with the seasons, the soil, and the subtle ebb of politics and prestige. Yet even as they settled, the impulse to move did not vanish. Stories passed through the generations of kings who crossed seas, of ancestors buried in ships, of lands yet to be claimed. And always, there was the lure of the steppe to the east, open land, rich trade, and new horizons. The Vilkach phase of Gothic history marks a moment of crystallization, the solidification of culture, identity, and ambition. It was here, in the shadowed forests and rivers of the north, that the Gothic name began to carry weight. And as their graves filled and their settlements spread, the Goths looked once more beyond the known, toward the rivers that flowed eastward and the open grasslands that whispered of opportunity and danger alike. The journey was not yet over. It had merely paused to draw breath. In the quiet corridors of time, some migrations are lost to silence. Others leave a trail, in legend, in language, and in earth. The Gothic crossing from Scandinavia to the southern Baltic belongs to both. Jordanes, the 6th century Roman Gothic chronicler, tells of a king named Bur, a leader of old, who guided his people from the northern isle of Skansa. His was not an army of conquest, but a fleet of 3 ships, modest in number, vast in consequence. They crossed rough waters, found new shores, and drove out a people called the Rugi. Thus began the settlement of Gothiscansa. We cannot know whether Bur lived, nor if his name echoed in the speech of those who followed him. But the pattern of his tale, maritime departure, coastal landing, displacement of earlier peoples, aligns with the archaeological record. The Gothic migration was not a single voyage, but a sequence of journeys, unfolding over generations. Like the tides, it moved with quiet force. From Gotland and Gotaland, the Goths had traveled by sea and river, down the coasts and inland via tributaries and ancient trade paths. The shores of the Baltic, forested, marshy, but fertile, offered footholds for their ambitions. Settlements sprang up along the Vistula's banks. These were places of confluence, of traders and travelers, of cultures and commodities. Yet the journey was not merely physical. It marked a shift in consciousness, from tribe to people, from wandering clans to a rising collective. In these new lands, Gothic identity began to harden like fired clay. They remembered the North, honored the ancestors buried in boat-shaped graves, but looked southward now, toward the heartlands of empire, toward Rome. Alongside them, the Roman world loomed ever larger. Ships brought goods up from the Danube and Black Sea, fine glass, bronze mirrors, scarlet wool, and amphorae filled with olive oil or garum. In return, the Goths offered amber, furs, slaves, and ironwork. It was a relationship of trade, but also of watching, each studying the other. As the Goths settled, they did not merely occupy, they adapted. Their grave customs, once rooted in Scandinavian practice, evolved. Cremation continued but now shared space with inhumation. Roman coins, sometimes hundreds in a single burial, appear beside local pottery and Germanic brooches. A cultural blend took shape. And in the longhouses and assembly fields, stories grew. The Goths remembered their origin, the northern forests, the sea crossing, the ancestral kings. These tales became more than memory, they became myth, carried by bards, inscribed by later scribes, shaping identity. In time, the migration turned inward. The river valleys beckoned. The open grasslands of the east, vast and windswept, seemed to call them forward. It was not conquest that pulled the Goths, but opportunity, for pasture, for trade, for space. Thus the Great Migration continued, not as a sudden rupture, but as a patient unfolding. Family by family, group by group, the Goths pressed south and east, following ancient tracks worn by hooves and wheels. They were no longer simply wanderers. They were a people becoming a force, and in the centuries to come, all of Europe would reckon with their passage. By the 2nd and 3rd centuries after Christ, the Goths were no longer mere travelers across the forests and rivers of northern Europe. They had become settlers, artisans, and farmers, rooted in the land, yet never fully still. In the regions along the Vistula River and farther east, Gothic settlements grew in number and sophistication. These were not cities as Rome knew them, but spacious villages, clusters of long wooden houses, some more than 40 meters in length. Beneath their thatched roofs, generations lived together, elders, warriors, women weaving by the hearth, children learning the world from stories and song. Each homestead was more than shelter. It was a workshop, a granary, a place of memory. Central hearths glowed through the winters, and storage pits held grain through lean seasons. The earth itself, dark, fertile, and yielding, offered sustenance. The Goths raised barley, millet, and wheat. They tended cattle, pigs, and sheep. Horses, small and sturdy, grazed on the plains, prized for both plough and war. But it was not only the plough that shaped Gothic hands, it was fire and metal. From the blackened forges of their villages came brooches, fibulae, and blades, each shaped with care, often adorned with intricate designs of birds and beasts. Metalworkers melted bronze and silver, poured into molds, engraved with lines that spiraled and curled like branches or waves. The eagle-headed fibula, a signature of Gothic craftsmanship, emerged during these years, not merely an ornament, but a symbol of rank and tribal belonging. Trade continued to bind them to the wider world. Roman glassware, North Sea amber, Baltic furs, and Sarmatian horse gear all passed through Gothic hands. Coins from distant emperors bore faces and titles in Latin, circulating in Gothic markets, buried with Gothic dead. And yet, for all their growing contact with Rome, the Goths remained distinct. Their social order was shaped not by imperial law but by custom and clan. At the top stood warrior chieftains, reichs, as they were called, whose strength in battle and lineage from ancestral gods gave them authority. Below them, free farmers made up the backbone of society, their voices heard at the Thing, the great assembly where disputes were settled, laws spoken, and decisions made. Slaves and captives from raids or trade toiled at the margins, but even they were woven into the structure of Gothic life. Religion remained tied to nature and the unseen. They revered gods of war and fertility, of sky and soil. Sacred groves, standing stones, and offerings of weapons to marsh and lake told of a spiritual world alive and close at hand. The dead were buried with food and drink, with tools and trinkets, a final provision for the journey beyond. The rhythms of life followed the seasons. Planting in spring, reaping in summer, hunting and feasting in autumn, sheltering through the long northern winters. The sound of iron hammers, of flutes and horns, of horses on frozen paths, these formed the soundtrack of Gothic life. Yet even in this settled time, change stirred. The eastern horizon, the Pontic steppe, lay open and vast. Rumors came from traders of fertile lands, of great rivers, of peoples both hostile and wealthy. For some Goths, the forge and field were enough. For others, the old restlessness returned. Soon their gaze would turn again, not back toward the north, but eastward, toward the great grasslands where destiny awaited. To the east of the Carpathians, where the land unfurls in waves of green and gold, the Pontic steppe stretches toward the horizon, a vast, fertile, and unclaimed. It was into this great open expanse that the Goths now moved. The migration was not abrupt. It came in phases, over generations, as Gothic groups, perhaps pressed by population or drawn by opportunity, followed the river valleys southward and east. The old settlements in the Vistula basin were not abandoned all at once. But the center of Gothic life began to shift. The new land was different. There were no forests to shelter under, no rocky shores. Instead, the land rolled like a sea, broken only by rivers and low hills. Here, under the wide sky, the Goths found both bounty and challenge. This new phase of settlement is marked in the archaeological record by what scholars call the Cherniakov culture, named for a site near modern Kiev. Spanning much of Ukraine and reaching into Moldova and Romania, it bore the clear marks of Gothic continuity, the pottery, the brooches, the longhouses. But it also bore signs of change. For the Goths were not alone. In this land they encountered others, Sarmatians with their swift cavalry and nomadic pastures, remnants of the once mighty Scythians, now farmers and traders, and other Germanic tribes, like the Gepids and Heruli, migrating southward as well. From these peoples, the Goths learned new ways, how to ride and fight from horseback, how to herd across long distances, how to defend vast, exposed frontiers. Settlements in this era were large and organized. Some, like those at Komponitsi and Budesti, housed thousands. They were placed carefully, near rivers for water, on heights for defense. The villages had distinct quarters, dwellings, workshops, and storage pits. The architecture was familiar, but more varied now, reflecting local influences and new materials. The economy grew more complex. Grain was stored in sunken silos. Fields of barley and wheat fed not only villagers, but trade caravans. Herds of sheep and cattle roamed the plains, while horses, lean and enduring, became central to life. Horse gear, bits, and ornate saddles appear in graves. Riding was no longer rare, it was a daily necessity. Craftsmanship too reached new heights. Metalworkers produced intricate fibulae, silver, bronze, sometimes gilded, often in the form of animals or geometric patterns. The famed treasure of Pietroesa, with its gold eagle brooch and garnet inlays, speaks of a culture that had grown both rich and refined. Religion adapted but endured. The gods of the Goths still watched from the sky and grove, but new influences seeped in. Scythian burial styles, Sarmatian horse sacrifices, Roman trinkets bearing foreign symbols, all found their way into Gothic rituals. The sacred and the worldly intermingled. And power, too, was changing. The old model of tribal chieftains gave way to something larger. To rule such vast territories, one needed more than martial skill. Kings emerged, leaders with courts, with alliances, with legitimacy drawn from both blood and divine favor. The thing still met, but now under the shadow of a throne. This time among the steppes was more than a migration. It was a transformation from tribal migrants to a settled, diverse, and powerful people. The land shaped them, and they, in turn, reshaped the land. But peace would not last forever. Beyond the eastern rivers, another force stirred, swift, merciless, and unknown. The Huns had begun to ride. By the 3rd century after Christ, the Pontic Caspian steppe, stretching from the lower Danube to the banks of the Dniester and beyond, had become the new homeland of the Goths. Here, among vast pastures and slow-moving rivers, they built a civilization both ancient and new. The culture that grew in this region, the Chernikov, bore the unmistakable imprint of Gothic tradition, but it was no longer purely Gothic. This was a world of mingled tribes and shared destinies. Sarmatians, Alans, and remnants of the old Scythians mingled with Germanic settlers. Each group brought its own customs, gods, and skills. The result was not chaos, but synthesis. Settlements grew larger and more stable. Excavations at places like Komarov, Cernjakov, and Megara reveal well-planned villages, longhouses for extended families, workshops for pottery and metalwork, granaries built into the earth. The land was kind. Rich black soil yielded harvests that could feed growing populations. Horses and cattle thrived on the open grasslands, and trade routes crisscrossed the territory, linking the Baltic to the Black Sea, the steppes to the cities of Rome and Byzantium. The Gothic economy flourished. Farmers tilled the land with iron plowshares. Craftsmen produced elegant grey ceramics, wheel-thrown, burnished, and often decorated with fine incised lines. These vessels, found from the Danube to the Dnieper, speak of a cultural cohesion that stretched across hundreds of kilometers. Metalwork reached new heights. The eagle-headed fibula, now a hallmark of Gothic identity, evolved in design, more detailed, more ornate. Silver and bronze were shaped into brooches, belt fittings, and weapon hilts. The famed treasure of Pietroasa, buried in Romania and discovered centuries later, contains a golden eagle fibula weighing over half a kilogram, adorned with garnets and feathers crafted in exquisite repousse. This was also an age of kings. The scale of Gothic settlement demanded new leadership. Chieftains still ruled local clans, but above them stood rulers with authority over vast territories, men who commanded warriors, presided over assemblies, and negotiated with Roman envoys. Their courts were not cities, but mobile centers of power, where tribute was gathered, justice dispensed, and alliances forged through marriage, oath, and gift. The Goths did not rule alone. They shared their lands with others, willingly or by necessity. Sarmatian horsemen, skilled in mounted warfare, were both allies and rivals. Their techniques, lances, scale armor, disciplined cavalry, left a deep mark on Gothic military organization. Scythians, though diminished, passed on agricultural practices suited to the steppe and styles of animal art that found their way into Gothic decoration. The Romans too played their part. Traders brought glassware, wine, tools, and silver coins. Emperors sent envoys and sometimes subsidies, seeking peace on their frontiers or recruits for their legions. Gothic leaders learned Roman ways, even as they remained proudly independent. The social fabric grew more complex. Beneath the king stood an aristocracy of warriors and landholders. Below them, free farmers, craftsmen, and herdsmen. Slaves, often war captives, worked fields or served in households. The thing continued to meet, but power increasingly lay in the hands of those who could command both swords and speech. Amidst this growth, religion remained deeply rooted in tradition. Sacred groves, rites of passage, offerings of weapons and food, all continued. Yet signs of change appeared. Roman deities, Eastern amulets, and hints of Christianity filtered in. Some graves bore crosses, others, horse skulls and spearheads. The spiritual world of the Goths was becoming as layered as their political one. In the Cherniakov lands, the Goths had found not just refuge, but a future. They were no longer migrants. They were builders, rulers, and traders, a people at the peak of their strength. But the steppe is never still. And on the far edge of the world, the ground began to tremble under the hooves of horsemen no one yet understood. As the Gothic world deepened its roots across the Pontic steppe, a new question emerged: who would rule, and how? The Gothic tribes had never known empire. They had no palaces, no marble forums, no written laws carved in stone. Their governance was older, shaped by custom and the voice of the free. Yet as their population swelled and territories stretched from the Carpathians to the Dniester, the need for leadership beyond the village and the clan became unavoidable. The earliest form of Gothic governance remained the thing, a gathering of free men, where disputes were heard, alliances formed, and decisions made. It was a place of equality, at least in principle. Elders spoke with weight, warriors with pride. Yet it was also a place of theatre, where charisma could sway, and where those with renown, in battle, in diplomacy, might rise. Out of this tradition, kingship took root. The Gothic word for king, Reichs, carried more than political meaning. A Reichs was not simply a ruler, he was a protector, a war leader, a judge. His authority rested not only on power, but on lineage, on victory, and on a sacred bond with the gods. Some claim descent from the divine, invoking Gapt or Got, a mythical ancestor god, echoing Odin of the Norse. These kings did not rule over centralized states. Their power was personal, not bureaucratic. They relied on loyalty, not taxes. Their courts were mobile, following the seasons, the needs of diplomacy, or the rumblings of war. But within their reach, they commanded warriors, oversaw judgments, and represented their people before the Romans. And the Romans, for their part, began to recognize the significance of these kings. They sent envoys, offered titles, and sought alliances. Gothic kings became foederati, allied rulers who received subsidies or command in exchange for peace or troops. This was diplomacy wrapped in flattery and calculation. Yet kingship never entirely replaced the assembly. The thing remained the soul of Gothic liberty. Even kings had to speak before it, to persuade, to be acclaimed. They could not rule by decree. The balance was delicate, between aristocratic authority and popular consent, between tradition and ambition. At the heart of Gothic governance stood the warrior nobility. These were the companions of the king, the optimates, whose power rested on land, arms, and kinship. They formed the king's warband, sat at his council, and expected rewards, gold, captives, and prestige. Their loyalty could lift a king or undo him. Below them were the free men, farmers, craftsmen, herders, each bound to their community, each with a voice at the thing. Beneath them, in households and fields, lived the slaves, often captured in war or born into servitude outside the assembly, but woven into the fabric of society. Law, too, flowed from tradition. There were no written codes, but laws were remembered, in song, in judgment, in ritual. Compensation for injury, oaths upon sacred objects, vengeance for blood, these governed life and kept balance. The law was not static, but lived through speech and example. Religion gave kingship its sacred hue. Kings presided over rites, offered to the gods, and guarded the link between tribe and divine. Some rituals, animal sacrifice, feasting, the burial of leaders with weapons and wealth, reinforced the cosmic order. A king was both servant and symbol, mortal and myth. In this world of vast plains and shifting alliances, kingship provided focus. It gave voice to unity amid diversity, strength in the face of Rome, and identity in an age of movement. Yet it was never absolute. The assembly endured. The people remembered. The Gothic way, between sword and speech, between king and clan, had found its form. But storm clouds gathered. A new power stirred beyond the eastern horizon, swift as the wind and merciless as the steppe. The world the Goths had built would soon be tested as never before. In the 3rd century of our era, the Gothic world stood at a threshold. Prosperous and well-organized, they ruled vast lands between the Carpathians and the Black Sea. Yet to the south loomed the Roman Empire, old, vast, and troubled. The frontier between these two worlds was a line not of stone, but of shifting pressure, guarded by Roman forts along the Danube, watched by Gothic scouts, and traversed by merchants, envoys, and wanderers. For years, peace had held. Trade flourished, Roman coins flowed northward, and Gothic goods, amber, furs, and slaves, flowed south. But empires falter, and borders bleed. By the 230s AD, Rome was weak. Civil war raged, emperors rose and fell, and the frontier lay thinly held. The Goths saw their chance, not only to raid, but to shape events beyond the river. The first major incursion came in 238 AD. Under the leadership of unnamed war chiefs, Gothic warriors crossed the Danube in force. No longer content with quick plunder, they moved in waves, targeting Roman towns and fortresses. Their tactics had evolved: swift cavalry strikes, coordination between bands, and the building of fortified camps in enemy territory. This was no mere looting. It was testing of Roman resolve and of Gothic power. Roman resistance was sluggish. Troops had been drawn westward, and local militias could not withstand disciplined Gothic formations. The invaders laid siege to cities, took hostages, and extracted ransom. Then, as Roman legions began to return, the Goths withdrew, not defeated, but enriched. These early raids taught them lessons in siege warfare, logistics, and Roman weakness. By the 240s, Gothic armies had grown bolder. They penetrated deeper, reaching into Thrace and Moesia. In 250 AD, they struck again, but this time, with ambition. The target was Philippopolis, a major Roman city in Thrace. Gothic forces besieged it for months, building earthworks and siege engines, some likely crafted by captured Roman engineers. Their patience paid off. The city fell. Plundered and burned, it stood as a symbol that even Rome's walls could crumble. The Emperor Decius responded with urgency. He gathered a large army and marched to confront the invaders. The two forces met at Abritus in 251 AD, and there, the unthinkable happened. The Roman army was routed. Emperor Decius fell in battle, becoming the first Roman emperor killed in combat against a foreign foe. The Goths, well organized and led by seasoned commanders, had broken the empire's pride. From that moment, the Gothic name echoed differently in Roman halls. They were no longer simply raiders from the north. They were a force, martial, mobile, and capable of shaping the fate of provinces. Yet the Goths did not seek to hold territory, not yet. Their aim was plunder, not dominion. They returned across the Danube, laden with wealth, weapons, and captives. But they had glimpsed something more, the vulnerability of Rome, and the possibilities it held. Over the next decades, Gothic raids became more frequent, more coordinated. They reached into the Balkans, into Asia Minor, even across the Black Sea by ship, a Gothic fleet attacking the cities of Bithynia and Cappadocia. These were no longer isolated warbands. They were the armed wings of a confederation, under kings who understood both Gothic tradition and Roman ambition. Rome, for its part, oscillated between diplomacy and force. Emperors offered treaties, titles, and subsidies to Gothic leaders in exchange for peace, or troops, or promises. At times, it worked. At others, it failed. The frontier had become porous, not just to raiders, but to culture, to faith, to fate. For the Goths, these years marked a transition from scattered tribal raiders to a cohesive power with kings, war councils, and a vision of more than plunder. They had seen Roman weakness and tasted Roman wealth. And some began to wonder, why take it and leave? Why not stay? The age of raids was ending. The age of realms was about to begin. By the middle of the 3rd century, the Gothic peoples had begun to outgrow the role Rome had long assigned them, that of seasonal raiders, useful mercenaries, and distant tribes beyond the limes. They were becoming something more. The great Gothic victories at Philippopolis and Abratus had revealed the unthinkable, that Rome, for centuries the master of Europe, could be defeated, even humiliated. And though the Goths had returned across the Danube with their spoils, they had not retreated in spirit. Their leaders had seen the provinces burn. They had learned the rhythms of Roman warfare and the fractures within the empire. They had tasted conquest. In the decades that followed, Gothic armies grew in strength and sophistication. No longer simply bands of warriors, they moved with calculated strategy. They constructed fortified camps within Roman lands. They laid sieges not as wild assailants but as patient engineers, using rams, towers, and trenches. They moved by river and by sea. Fleets of Gothic ships, crude but capable, began to appear along the Black Sea coast. Their goals too had shifted. Where once they came for plunder alone, now they stayed longer, raiding deeper, demanding tribute. They did not yet seek permanent rule, but they tested the limits of Roman resistance, and increasingly, they found it wanting. Roman emperors, meanwhile, were caught in a whirlwind of crises. Civil wars raged, borders faltered, and the treasury ran thin. At times, Gothic leaders received Roman gold not as payment for loyalty, but as ransom for peace. Some emperors tried to co-opt the Gothic threat. They offered Gothic chieftains Roman military commands or noble titles, hoping to divide and control. Others tried force, but with mixed success. The frontier along the Danube, once a clear border, had become a zone of contestation. Settlements were attacked and rebuilt. Forts changed hands. Farmers fled or paid tribute to Gothic overlords. It was during this era that a new type of Gothic leader began to emerge, not just a war chieftain, but a king in the Roman sense. These men held more than personal loyalty, they commanded confederations. They negotiated with emperors, brokered alliances, and led armies numbering in the tens of thousands. Their courts, though still mobile, began to resemble royal centers, with advisors, scribes, and foreign envoys. Among these leaders, names like Cniver and Cannibord survive, chieftains who led campaigns against Roman cities and fortresses, whose victories were recorded by their foes. They became symbols of a rising Gothic power that no longer simply threatened the empire's edges but actively shaped its fate. The internal structure of Gothic society was also evolving. As wealth flowed in, from ransom, trade, and tribute, new social layers emerged. A warrior elite, adorned with Roman weapons and foreign silks, now dominated. Their graves contain golden fibulae, decorated sword hilts, and goblets of Byzantine make. The peasantry, though still free in name, grew more dependent. Slavery, once rare, became widespread, with Roman captives often at the bottom. Religion, too, began to shift. Amidst the artifacts of Gothic graves, Christian symbols began to appear, crosses, inscriptions, and, later, entire communities of believers. Some captives brought the faith southward, others embraced it from within. For now, the old gods still ruled, gods of war, sky, and fate. But the seed had been planted. The Goths had changed, and they knew it. They were no longer a people hiding in forests or clinging to the edges of empire. They were a power unto themselves, feared and courted, attacked and envied. Their ascendancy was not yet empire, but it was real, rooted in victories won, in territories controlled, and in the growing sense that their destiny now stretched beyond the steppes. But with every rise comes new trials. And soon, from the east, would come a storm unlike any before, one that would challenge everything they had built. While Gothic swords carved paths through Roman lands and Gothic kings spoke in the language of war and tribute, a quieter revolution was unfolding, one that would shape not only the Gothic spirit but its memory for all time. In the early decades of the 4th century, among the Gothic communities living along the lower Danube, a boy was born. His name was Wulfila, or, as it would come to be known in Roman form, Ulfila. His mother had been a Christian captive, taken during one of the raids into Cappadocia. His father was Gothic, a man of rank and likely of warrior blood. Ulfila was raised at the crossroads of worlds. He spoke Gothic by birth, Greek through his mother, and Latin by necessity. He knew the Gothic gods, yet he also heard the prayers of the Christians, quiet, forbidden, persistent. As he grew in learning, he was drawn to the Christian faith, not the imperial orthodoxy of Rome, but a version known as Arianism, which emphasized the divinity of God the Father over that of Christ the Son. In time, Ulfila became a bishop, ordained in Constantinople, and then sent back among his people not to conquer, but to preach. It was no easy task. The Gothic heart was bound to tradition, to the old gods, the old songs, the old codes of honor. But Ulfila was patient. He did not impose, he translated. Most of all, he gave the Goths something no other Germanic people had yet received, a written language of their own. With a blend of Greek, Latin, and runic letters, Ulfila created the Gothic alphabet, suited to the sounds of their tongue, expressive enough to bear sacred scripture. Then, line by line, he undertook one of the most ambitious works of his age, the translation of the Bible into Gothic. The effect was profound. For the first time, the word, once heard only in Latin by Roman priests or in Greek in the eastern cities, now spoke in the Gothic tongue. It resonated in the halls of chieftains and in the fields of the common folk. The message was clear: the Christian God was not only the God of Romans, but of all peoples, even the Goths. Ulfila's Bible became more than a text. It became a cultural anchor. It taught not only scripture but language, identity, and permanence. His followers, known as the Gothic Christians, began to form communities, some in Roman territory, others beyond the border, tolerated or protected by imperial favor. But not all welcomed the change. Among the Gothic elite, many saw Christianity, especially of the Arian form, as a threat to the old ways. Pagan kings persecuted converts. Ulfila himself was forced to flee with his followers into Moesia, under Roman protection, where they formed a Gothic Christian enclave. Yet the seed had been planted. In the years to come, Christianity would spread across the Gothic world, not imposed by force, but carried by the breath of a translated word. It gave the Goths not only a faith but a connection to the Roman world, to the divine, and to the enduring power of the written word. And so, even as Gothic warbands crossed frontiers and Gothic kings faced Rome in battle, a quieter thread wove through their history, of scripture, of song, of faith spoken in their own tongue. When the kingdoms rose and fell, when the swords rusted and the old gods faded, Ulfila's legacy endured. His Bible, copied in silver and gold ink upon purple parchment, would one day lie in a monastery in distant lands, a fragile mirror of a people's soul. In Ulfila, the Goths found not only a translator of scripture, but a translator of destiny, from raiders and rulers to partakers in a faith that spanned empires and centuries. As the 4th century unfolded, the Gothic world stood divided, not in war, but in geography and in way of life. The Great Migration into the Pontic steppe had created a Gothic dominion stretching from the foothills of the Carpathians in the west to the River Don in the east. It was too vast for any one king to rule, too varied in soil, climate, and neighbor. Over time, two great branches of the Gothic people emerged, the Tervingi and the Greuthungi. These names, first recorded by Roman authors, may have meant little to the Goths themselves. They spoke of lands, not blood, the Tervingi, forest people, dwelling among the woodlands and valleys of Dacia and the lower Danube, the Greuthungi, steppe people, spread across the open plains and riverlands to the east. The Tervingi built their world among hills and rivers, a land of farms, orchards, and fortified villages. Their society, shaped by contact with Rome, grew more structured. Some adopted Roman dress, Roman customs, even Roman names. Their kings ruled from fixed seats, administered laws, and commanded professional retinues. Christianity, especially in its Arian form, found fertile ground among them, spread by preachers like Ulfila and reinforced by proximity to the empire. In the West, the Tervingi had become, in many ways, semi-Roman, allies and adversaries, students and skeptics of the great power that loomed over them. The Greuthungi, by contrast, remained children of the steppe. Their lands were wide and open, bounded by no forest edge or imperial road. Their lives followed the herds and the winds. Mobility shaped everything: their houses, built to move; their armies, composed largely of cavalry; their politics, looser, tribal, held together by the strength of individual chieftains and alliances forged in war and feasting. The Gothic encountered different neighbors: Sarmatians, Alans, Huns, and from them they learned the ways of the horse and the bow. Their armies emphasized speed, endurance, and shock. Their settlements were smaller, more scattered. Though trade with the Roman world still flowed, their gaze often turned eastward. Religion too took different paths. While some Gothic adopted Christianity, many clung to older gods, spirits of sky and river, of storm and fate. Sacred groves still held meaning. Warrior graves bore offerings of horses, weapons, and runic signs. The gods of the Gothic remained near, fierce, and proud. And yet, for all these differences, the two branches remained kin. They shared a language, with dialectal variation, but mutual understanding. They shared customs of law, of burial, of leadership. Kings and nobles intermarried. Warriors fought together against common foes. The names of gods, of heroes, of ancestors, these still bound them across the rivers and plains. But time and space had begun to shape them differently. The Tervingi were becoming a settled people, tied to towns and fields, with laws influenced by Rome and clergy who preached peace. The Gothic were still riders of the steppe, fierce, free, and wary of empires. These two paths would soon face a common test. For from beyond the Don and the Caspian Sea, from lands barely known even to the steppe peoples, a storm was rising, a tide of horsemen fierce and swift, who neither bartered nor bowed. The Huns were coming. And neither the Tervingi in their valleys, nor the Gothic on their plains, would remain untouched. It began as whispers, from the easternmost camps, from frightened Sarmatian traders, from refugees with wild eyes. Tales of a people who moved like wind, who needed no harvest, who rode from the mists of the unknown. The Huns had come. No one knew quite from where. Perhaps from the deep interior of Asia, beyond the Caspian, beyond the desert. Some said they were forged of night and storm, their skulls stretched long by the bindings of childhood, their eyes slanted, their faces scarred by years of wind and war. They were like no people the Goths had ever met. They lived on horseback. Slept, ate, fought, hunted, all in the saddle. Their mounts were short, tireless, fast. Their weapons were strange and deadly, short, curved bows of wood and sinew, capable of piercing armor from astonishing distances. They struck without warning, vanished before pursuit. Where they passed, nothing remained. At first, the Gothic bore the brunt. Their wide steppes, open and undefended, offered little shelter. Villages vanished overnight. Herds were driven off, watchposts burned, chieftains slain in their halls. The great Gothic king Ermanaric, who had ruled over an eastern confederation vast and rich, found his power crumbling beneath him. In later tales, it was said he took his own life, unable to face the ruin that came. With the death of Ermanaric, the east fell into confusion. Tribes scattered. Some submitted to Hunnic rule, becoming clients or auxiliaries. Others fled westward, seeking safety among their Tervingi kin or beyond the Roman frontier. But the Huns were not content to remain in the east. Their momentum carried them toward the lands of the Tervingi. These, though more structured and Roman-influenced, were no less vulnerable. Their kings, including the aging Athanaric, a staunch defender of the old gods, attempted to resist. Fortified settlements were defended, alliances summoned. Yet even the Carpathians could not hold the tide. By 376 AD, the pressure had become unbearable. Entire Gothic populations, warriors, elders, children, entire clans, gathered at the Danube, pleading for Roman protection. King Fritigern, once a rival of Athanaric and now leader of a vast multitude, sent envoys to the Roman Emperor Valens. "Let us cross," he begged. "Let us live within your borders, farm your lands, serve as soldiers. We will abandon our weapons. We will give hostages. We seek only peace and survival." It was a moment unlike any in Roman memory. For centuries, the Goths had raided, allied, traded. Now they asked for shelter. Emperor Valens, ruling from Constantinople and faced with other threats in the east, saw opportunity. Here was a chance to gain new soldiers, new taxpayers, to Romanize the Goths from within. He agreed. The Danube crossing would be allowed. But the crossing, when it came, was chaos. Thousands crowded the banks. Not just Tervingi, but Groithungi, Sarmatians, fugitives of every kind. Food ran short. Roman officials, greedy and corrupt, demanded bribes for safe passage. Weapons were not always surrendered. Hostages were taken, then neglected. Gothic nobles were insulted, Gothic women abused, Gothic warriors left to starve. The Huns had driven them from their homeland. Rome would push them to rebellion. And so, the arrival of the Huns, a force unknown and unknowable, did more than destroy the Gothic world of the East. It set into motion events that would reshape the empire itself. For now the Goths were within Rome's walls. And soon, they would rise. In the year 376, the Danube ceased to be a frontier and became a lifeline. Along its banks, thousands of Gothic refugees stood in desperation. Men with weather-worn faces, women clutching children, warriors still armed despite Roman demands, nobles displaced from ruined villages. Behind them, the eastern steppe burned beneath the hoofbeats of the Huns. Ahead, the Roman Empire promised safety, or so they hoped. Their leader was Fritigern, a man both practical and bold. Once a rival to Athanaric, king of the Tervingi, he had embraced Christianity, allied himself with the Romans, and now led a fractured people in search of refuge. His appeals to Emperor Valens were clear and urgent: "Allow us to cross the river, and we will be your allies, your settlers, your soldiers." Valens, cautious yet intrigued, agreed. It was not the first time Rome had permitted barbarians to settle within its borders. The empire had long absorbed foreign peoples, Franks, Alemanni, Vandals, turning them into federates, auxiliaries, and even citizens. But this movement was unlike any before. It was not a few thousand men. It was a nation on the move. The crossing began, slow, chaotic, and poorly managed. The Romans, lacking the infrastructure for such a vast migration, allowed only a portion of the Gothic population to pass at a time. Barges were scarce, and many swam or improvised rafts. Some drowned. Others died of hunger before even reaching Roman soil. But worse awaited them on the other side. The imperial officials entrusted with managing the resettlement, Lupicinus and Maximus, were greedy and incompetent. Supplies were withheld. Food was sold at extortionate prices. Some Goths, it is said, were forced to sell their children into slavery for a handful of rotten meat. Humiliation and suffering mounted. Tension soon turned to violence. The Romans, fearing disorder, attempted to disarm the Goths and break up their camps. Fritigern pleaded for patience, for proper settlements, for land to farm, for justice. But his words fell on deaf ears. Instead, Roman troops attempted to arrest or kill Gothic leaders under the guise of hospitality. At a banquet held in Marcianopolis, the city of the province, Lupicinus ordered the murder of Gothic envoys. Fritigern escaped. His warriors, enraged and starving, erupted into rebellion. The war that followed was not planned, but it was relentless. The Goths, hardened by their ordeals and led by a seasoned commander, began raiding the countryside. Roman forts fell or fled. Entire villages were emptied. The rebellion grew as discontented slaves, former captives, and even local peasants joined the Gothic cause. Valens, hearing of the uprising, prepared for war. In the summer of 378, he marched north from Constantinople, determined to crush what he still believed to be a ragged band of insurgents. He refused to wait for reinforcements from the Western Emperor, Gratian. He sought glory and vengeance for the humiliation Rome had suffered. He would receive neither. For the Goths, now battle-hardened and united, awaited him on the plains near Adrianople. And there, one of the greatest catastrophes in Roman military history was about to unfold. The summer of 378 drew heavy with tension. The sun beat down upon the plains of Thrace, and beneath its light, two great forces converged, one driven by imperial pride, the other by desperation and fury. The Roman Emperor Valens, seated in Constantinople, had misjudged the scope of the Gothic uprising. He believed them scattered, poorly organized, and without the discipline to face a Roman legion in open battle. His advisers urged caution. Some advised waiting for reinforcements from his nephew Gratian in the west. But Valens desired swift victory. The rebellion had festered long enough. Fritigern, meanwhile, knew the stakes. He had led his people through terror and betrayal, and now stood at the head of a formidable force, not just warriors, but an entire nation in arms. His troops were seasoned by hardship, their morale fierce, their numbers swollen by Greuthungi allies and discontented Roman deserters. The two armies met near the city of Adrianople, in the hot August of that fateful year. On the morning of the battle, Valens marched out with roughly 15,000 to 20,000 men, infantry, cavalry, and auxiliaries. His scouts had failed him. He believed the Gothic force smaller than it was. In truth, Fritigern had positioned his warriors carefully. His infantry stood in a defensive laager, a wagon fort encircling their camp, while his cavalry remained hidden, riding out to forage but ready to return at a signal. The battle began not with a charge, but with parley. Fritigern, knowing the strength of Roman arms, sent envoys to delay. He offered negotiations, likely with little sincerity. He lit fires to obscure Roman vision, loose skirmishers to harass their lines. He waited for his cavalry to return. Valens, tired of delay and craving glory, ordered the assault. Roman infantry pressed forward against the Gothic wagon fort. Fighting was intense but uncertain. Then, at the moment when victory seemed within reach, the Gothic cavalry returned, not in disarray, but in formation. Thousands of mounted warriors thundered down upon the Roman flanks, catching them mid-assault, exposed and unprepared. The legions crumpled. Roman lines buckled, then collapsed under the sudden, sweeping cavalry attack. Panic surged. Some units held their ground, others fled. The sun glinted off spear points, chariot wheels, and fleeing armor. Bodies piled, screams rose, dust choked the sky. Valens himself perished, his exact fate unknown. Some said he was struck by an arrow and carried into a farmhouse, which the Goths burned, unaware of who lay inside. Others claimed he died on the field, unrecognized amid the carnage. When the day ended, the field was strewn with Roman dead. 2/3 of the army lay slain, generals, tribunes, officers. It was the worst Roman military disaster since the Battle of Cannae, centuries earlier. The empire stood shaken. The Goths did not march on Constantinople, the city's walls were strong, and their cause still rooted in survival, not conquest. But the myth of Roman invincibility was shattered. For the first time in generations, an emperor had fallen in battle against barbarian foes, and the legions had failed to recover the field. Adrianople changed everything. It showed that Rome could be defeated not by distant empires or civil strife, but by a migrant people, driven to rebellion by mistreatment and betrayal. It marked the end of Rome's dominance along the Danube frontier, and the beginning of a new age, where barbarians no longer begged for admittance, but bargained from strength. The Goths had not only survived, they had prevailed. And though the war would continue, the balance had shifted. A new power had entered the imperial world, and it would not be easily undone. In the wake of Adrianople, the Roman Empire stood stunned. An emperor lay dead. The elite of the Eastern Field Army was gone, their shields shattered, their banners lost. The Danubian provinces lay open, not to invasion, but to occupation. The Goths, once seen as refugees, had defeated Rome in open battle and now moved through its lands not as guests, but as victors. Yet they did not destroy. They did not burn every city, nor seize the imperial capital. They had no siege engines, no hunger for imperial thrones. What they wanted was something different: stability, land, and a place within the world they had once only glimpsed. For 2 years, Gothic bands roamed Thrace and Moesia. They raided towns, extorted food and silver, and clashed with remaining Roman outposts. But they also negotiated. Fritigern, though not crowned in Roman fashion, now held kingly authority. He controlled a united Gothic host, and he wielded it with calculation. He sought not the ruin of Rome, but recognition. The empire, meanwhile, staggered to its feet. In 379, a new emperor was appointed in the east, Theodosius, a Spaniard of military background, cautious yet determined. He inherited a broken army and shattered morale. But he understood something few before him had grasped: the Goths were no longer a foreign tribe. They were a presence within the empire itself, and they were here to stay. Theodosius began by rebuilding. He recruited fresh troops, many of them themselves barbarian, Huns, Alans, and even Goths from other regions. He fortified cities, reorganized administration, and most importantly, opened lines of negotiation with the Gothic leadership. By 382, after years of skirmishing and diplomacy, a peace was struck. The Goths were granted land within the empire, likely in Thrace and Moesia, and the right to govern themselves under their own leaders. In return, they were expected to provide military service to the empire. Not as mercenaries, but as federates, foederati, allied peoples within the imperial fold. This agreement was unprecedented. It did not dissolve the Gothic identity, nor fully absorb them into Roman life. Instead, it formalized a dual existence, Goths within Rome, but not of it. They kept their kings. They preserved their laws. They spoke their tongue and prayed in Arian churches, distinct from the Nicene Christianity now dominant in Constantinople. And yet, they also served in Roman armies, guarded Roman frontiers, and drew grain from Roman storehouses. Some Roman voices cried betrayal. That barbarians could settle inside the empire, farmed, proud, and semi-autonomous, seemed a harbinger of decline. Others saw it as necessity, the only path forward after Adrianople's devastation. Among the Goths, the peace brought stability but not unity. Fritigern disappears from the record not long after. New leaders arose, some willing to embrace Roman life, others wary of its influence. Younger generations had never known the forests of the Vistula or the open steppe. They were born in Roman provinces, spoke Latin alongside Gothic, and saw Rome not as an enemy but as a stage. Yet beneath the surface, tensions remained. The Gothic position was ambiguous, Roman allies, yet still outsiders, soldiers of the empire, yet not citizens of it. They were needed, but not trusted. Honored, yet not fully welcomed. It was a balance that could not last forever. In the shadows of Rome's walls, a new generation of Goths was coming of age, bold, impatient, and led by a warrior destined to shake the very heart of empire. His name was Alaric. From the forests and fields of Roman Thrace, sometime around the year 370, a child was born among the Goths. His name was Alaric, a name that would one day echo across marble halls and down ruined streets. He was born into the world shaped by the Treaty of 382, a world where Goths lived within the Roman Empire, but not as Romans. They farmed Roman land, fought in Roman armies, but remained distinct, led by their own chieftains, loyal to their own customs. Alaric grew up hearing both the prayers of Arian bishops and the orders of Roman generals. He was raised in the rhythms of two civilizations. As he came of age, he took up the sword. Like many Gothic youths, he entered Roman service, likely as part of the Federate auxiliaries, serving alongside imperial troops. He learned Roman discipline, Roman strategy, Roman ambition. But he also saw the quiet scorn, the second-hand pay, the distrust in Roman eyes. He fought for an empire that would use the Goths, but never quite embrace them. By the end of the 4th century, the empire stood once again divided, east and west, Constantinople and Ravenna, Greek and Latin, two courts with rival priorities. Theodosius the Great, who had brought a measure of unity and peace, died in 395. His sons, Arcadius in the east, Honorius in the west, were young, untested, and surrounded by ambitious ministers. Into this vacuum stepped Alaric. He had risen by merit and lineage, commanding the respect of Gothic warriors and the attention of Roman politicians. In 395, soon after Theodosius' death, Alaric was proclaimed Reichs by his people, a king, no longer just a general. The moment marked a turning point. The Goths, long content to serve as Rome's sword arm, now sought a place of their own. Alaric began his reign not with rebellion, but with movement. He led his people, tens of thousands of warriors, along with their families, wagons, and herds, southward into Greece. His aim was not destruction, but recognition. He demanded status, land, a formal title within the Roman hierarchy. The empire refused. So Alaric acted. He swept through Macedonia, Thessaly, and into the Peloponnese. Ancient cities fell before him: Corinth, Argos, Sparta. The temples stood silent. The old gods offered no aid. Yet Alaric spared much. He demanded ransom, not ruin. His war was political, not personal. The Eastern Emperor Arcadius, powerless to resist, eventually granted him what he wanted, the title of Magister Militum per Illyricum, Master of Soldiers in the province. It was a Roman command for a Gothic king, uneasy, improvised, but real. But the arrangement did not last. The court at Constantinople feared his growing power. In 397, the Roman general Stilicho, himself of mixed barbarian descent and commander-in-chief of the Western armies, marched east to dislodge Alaric. Political wrangling spared the Gothic king, but also left him stranded, his ambitions thwarted. So Alaric turned west. He watched as the Western Empire floundered under Honorius, isolated in the fortified city of Ravenna. He saw Rome, the eternal city, once unassailable, weakened by court intrigue, fiscal collapse, and military decay. He knew the old roadways. He knew Roman tactics. And he knew that his people, proud, hungry, and long denied a homeland, still followed him. Alaric was no mere warlord. He was a bridge between Gothic grievance and Roman failure, between old oaths and new power. He would not fade like the others. He would make history answer. And he would march on Rome. By the year 401, the Western Roman Empire stood brittle, like a monument long unguarded. Its emperor, Honorius, ruled from the marsh-bound stronghold of Ravenna, cloistered behind its canals and walls. The legions were stretched thin, the treasury strained, and the provinces restless. Into this fragile world, Alaric brought the weight of Gothic purpose. He marched westward, not as a raider, but as a commander of a people. His Gothic host, families in wagons, warriors on horseback, priests and smiths, elders and children, moved not like an army, but like a nation in transit. They sought not only plunder, but place. In 401, Alaric crossed the Julian Alps and entered Italy, a feat no Gothic leader had dared since the days of Cannae and Carthage. Panic swept the cities. Rome had not seen a foreign army within its borders for centuries. Its defenders were unprepared, its leaders divided. The general Stilicho, of Vandal blood but Roman loyalty, rose to meet the threat. A formidable strategist, Stilicho saw in Alaric both danger and opportunity. He met the Gothic forces at Pollentia in 402. There, amid the blooming fields of early spring, battle was joined. Accounts vary. Some claim Roman victory, others see a draw. Alaric was forced to withdraw, but not defeated. His army remained intact, his prestige unbroken. He withdrew with dignity, negotiating safe passage and further subsidies. The road to Rome, for now, was closed, but only for a time. In the years that followed, diplomacy ebbed and flowed. Stilicho sought to use Alaric against rivals in the east. Alaric demanded recognition, gold, and a province for his people. Again and again, promises were made and broken. Then, in 408, all changed. Stilicho was assassinated, the victim of court intrigue and jealousy. With his death, the last stable hand on the reins of the Western Empire was gone. Gothic soldiers within the Roman army were slaughtered in purges. Alaric, outraged and cornered, acted. He crossed the Apennines and marched once more toward Rome, not with haste, but with purpose. The city, still proud, had no walls strong enough for its fear. Its senators pleaded. Alaric demanded gold, grain, and the freedom to settle. The Romans, desperate, agreed. A massive ransom was paid, 5,000 pounds of gold, 30,000 pounds of silver, silks, spices, and slaves. Still, the Emperor Honorius, safe behind Ravenna's marshes, refused Alaric's deeper demands, a title, land in Italy, and dignity for his people. Alaric negotiated again, and again was spurned. So in 409, he proclaimed a puppet emperor, Attalus, a Roman senator, crowned under Gothic protection. It was a move born not of conquest, but of frustration, a warning that Gothic power could shape even Rome's own crown. But Attalus proved weak and unpopular. The Roman population, proud and stubborn, still viewed the Goths as outsiders, invaders, unfit to lead. And so, in 410, Alaric abandoned the charade. He deposed Attalus and made one final attempt at negotiation with Honorius. It failed. And thus, Alaric, king of the Goths, Roman general once denied, turned his eyes upon the city of emperors, of Caesars, of gods. The march had ended. The gates now stood before him. On the night of August 24th, in the year 410, the gates of Rome opened, not to a parade, nor a returning emperor, but to a foreign king whose patience had worn thin. For 3 days and nights, the city that once ruled the world lay at the mercy of the Goths. It was not the first time Rome had been threatened, nor would it be the last. But this was different. For 8 centuries, Rome had stood untouched by foreign hands. Hannibal had come close, but never entered. Now, Alaric, king of the Goths, led his people through the Salarian Gate, and the spell of Roman invincibility was broken. Yet the sack was not what many feared. There was no wholesale slaughter, no torching of temples, no rivers of blood. Alaric was not a man of vengeance. His warriors were disciplined, and he had given strict orders to respect churches, especially those of St. Peter and St. Paul. The Goths themselves, largely Arian Christians, showed reverence toward these holy places. Still, the sack was real. Treasures, centuries in the making, were carried off: gold, jewels, silks, statues. The homes of the wealthy were ransacked, palaces emptied, silver vessels melted down. Noble families were stripped of generations of prestige. Some were taken captive, including the sister of the Western Emperor Honorius, Galla Placidia, who would later become a queen among the Goths. But even in this, there was a sense of order. It was a strike not of rage, but of cold, calculated necessity. The Goths were a people long denied land, titles, safety. Rome had used them, betrayed them, and refused to see them as equals. Now, they demanded attention. The shock across the Roman world was profound. St. Jerome, writing from Bethlehem, cried out, "The city which had taken the whole world was itself taken." Pagan voices muttered that this was the price of abandoning the old gods. Christians saw it as judgment, or trial, or proof that even earthly power could not shield from divine will. In Ravenna, Honorius did nothing. The emperor remained sheltered, silent, distant. Rome, once the center of imperial life, had long since been abandoned as capital. But the symbolism remained. The fall of Rome was not merely military, it was psychological. It marked the end of an illusion that Rome, eternal and unconquerable, could stand untouched forever. And what of Alaric? He did not remain in the city. His aim was never conquest, but leverage. After 3 days, he led his people south, hoping to cross into Africa, the empire's granary, rich and fertile. There, perhaps, he could build a new Gothic homeland. But fate had other plans. Before the journey could begin, Alaric fell ill, some say of fever, others of exhaustion. Near the river Busento in Calabria, he died, just weeks after achieving what no barbarian had ever done. Legend tells that his followers diverted the river's course, buried their king in its bed with treasure and honor, then returned the waters and slew the laborious, so that none might find the grave. Thus passed Alaric, the first Gothic king to sack Rome, not in hatred, but in weary defiance. His people mourned not only the man, but the vision he carried of a place for the Goths within the order of empire. The sack of Rome was not the end of the Goths. It was their grim entrance into history's spotlight. And now, a new leader would rise from among them, one who would lead not just warriors, but a kingdom. As one Gothic age ended with the passing of Alaric, another was quietly beginning in the distant northeast, among the Ostrogoths, those of the Greuthung line, who had remained longer under the shadow of the Huns. Born around the year 454, in the wake of Attila's death and the collapse of Hunnic dominion, Theodoric was raised not in a Gothic village but in the heart of the empire, Constantinople. At the age of 7, he was sent as a political hostage, part of a treaty between the Eastern Roman court and his father, Theodemir, king of the Ostrogoths. It was a clever exchange. The empire sought peace on its borders. The Goths sought Roman favor. Theodoric, brilliant and curious, received a Roman education. He learned Latin, Greek, military science, and the workings of imperial bureaucracy. He saw, firsthand, how Rome governed and endured. But he never forgot who he was. When he returned to his people, he brought with him not only knowledge, but ambition. Tall, imposing, skilled in war and fluent in diplomacy, Theodoric quickly rose in esteem. He led campaigns, crushed rivals, and became Rex, king of the Ostrogoths, around 471. Yet even as king, Theodoric walked between worlds. He served as Magister Militum under Emperor Zeno. At times, he was a friend to Constantinople, at others, a threat. The balance between Gothic independence and imperial patronage grew tense. Then came a proposal, one that would change history. In the West, the Roman Empire had collapsed. The boy emperor Romulus Augustulus had been deposed by the general Odoacer in 476. Italy was ruled now not by emperors, but by strong men. Zeno, wary of Odoacer's power, turned to Theodoric. "Take your people," he said, "and reclaim Italy. Rule it, if you can, in the emperor's name." In 488, Theodoric set out. The journey was no mere campaign. It was a migration, warriors, families, carts, livestock, the entire Ostrogothic nation, moving westward in search of a new home. The road was long and bitter. Battles with Odoacer's forces raged across the Alps and Po Valley for years. At last, in 493, Theodoric took Ravenna, by siege, by treaty, and, as some say, by treachery. He slew Odoacer with his own hand at a banquet. And with that act, he claimed Italy. But he did not claim it as a barbarian conqueror. He ruled as Rex Italiae, king of Italy, with the blessing of Constantinople, though never crowned as emperor. His rule would last over 30 years, and in that time, he forged something rare, a Gothic kingdom rooted not in chaos, but in order. His court at Ravenna was a marvel, a blend of Gothic strength and Roman tradition. He preserved Roman law for Romans, while the Goths retained their own customs. He restored aqueducts, preserved senatorial dignity, repaired roads and churches. His reign brought peace to a land long torn by invasion and civil war. He was, in every way, a bridge. A devout Arian Christian, Theodoric nonetheless protected Nicene Catholics. He welcomed philosophers, poets, and ambassadors. He corresponded with emperors, kings, and bishops. He sought not destruction, but legacy. In his later years, however, the balance grew precarious. Tensions with the Catholic majority deepened. Imperial suspicion from Constantinople returned. His final acts were marked by executions and mistrust, including the tragic death of the philosopher Boethius. Still, when Theodoric died in 526, he left behind something no Gothic king before him had achieved: a stable, prosperous realm that fused the Gothic and Roman worlds. He was buried in Ravenna, beneath a great stone dome, a tomb still standing, austere and eternal, like the man himself. Theodoric the Great was not merely a Gothic king. He was the last Roman ruler in spirit, though never in name. His death marked the end of an era, and the beginning of slow unraveling. The death of Theodoric in 526 marked the beginning of a slow unraveling, not in violence at first, but in erosion. For all his vision and strength, Theodoric's kingdom had no firm foundation to stand without him. His chosen successor was his grandson Athalaric, a boy still under the regency of his mother, Amalasuntha. She was wise and Roman in outlook, fluent in Greek and Latin, and determined to preserve her father's legacy. But she ruled in a world that had little patience for nuance. The Gothic nobles resented her Roman ways. They wanted strength, not conciliation. They saw her policies, her patronage of Roman scholars, her attempts to educate Athalaric in classical style, as betrayal. Conflict simmered. Athalaric, under pressure from both mother and Gothic warlords, succumbed to vice and illness. He died young, in 534. Amalasuntha, attempting to retain power, invited her cousin Theodahad to co-rule. But he betrayed her, imprisoned her, and soon after, had her murdered. The murder of Amalasuntha sent shock through the Mediterranean world. For the emperor in Constantinople, now Justinian I, it offered more than outrage. It offered opportunity. Justinian, a man of immense ambition, dreamed of reuniting the Roman world. Already, his general Belisarius had reconquered North Africa from the Vandals. Now, with Italy in turmoil and Gothic leadership fractured, the emperor turned his gaze westward once more. In 535, Belisarius landed in Sicily. The Gothic War had begun. It would last nearly 2 decades, not as a single campaign, but as a grinding, brutal contest of sieges, ambushes, betrayal, and devastation. At first, Belisarius advanced quickly. He took Naples, then Rome. Theodahad proved weak and was overthrown by Vitiges, a Gothic general of sterner metal. Yet even he could not halt the Roman advance. But Italy would not fall easily. The Goths, though pressed, regrouped. Under new leaders, first Vitiges, then Ildibad, Totila, and Teia, they fought with desperate vigor. They retook Rome, then lost it, then took it again. Cities changed hands multiple times. The countryside was ravaged. Famine followed siege. Peasants fled or died. Monasteries became refuges and tombs. Totila, among the Gothic kings, stood tallest in spirit. Charismatic and clever, he sought not just to resist but to restore. He treated Roman captives with mercy, tried to win back hearts, and even dreamed of coexistence. For a time, he rekindled the Gothic flame. But the empire was relentless. In 552, Justinian sent a new general, Narses, with vast resources. At the Battle of Tagini, Totila was slain. A year later, at Mons Lactarius, the last Gothic king Tea fell. The Austro-Gothic kingdom in Italy was extinguished. What followed was not peace. Italy lay in ruins. Fields were barren. Cities hollowed. Roman authority returned in name, but the fabric of the land had changed. Within a few years, a new tide, the Lombards, would descend, and the cycle would begin again. The Goths, once proud and ascendant, vanished not in a single blow, but in attrition. Some fled to the north. Others were absorbed into the population. Their language faded. Their laws were forgotten. Only ruins, tombs, and the echoes in Roman texts remained. And so ended the Gothic kingdom in Italy, not in triumph, nor in collapse, but in slow, grinding erasure. Yet their memory endured. They had crossed rivers, founded courts, challenged emperors, and crowned kings. They had written Bibles in their own tongue, ruled from Ravenna, and walked the streets of Rome. They had been, for a fleeting moment, both conquerors and heirs of empire. While the Ostrogoths rose and fell in Italy, their western kin, the Visigoths, found firmer ground in Hispania. The roots of this western kingdom stretched back to Alaric's successors. After the sack of Rome in 410, the Goths, now led by Alaric's brother-in-law Athaulf, turned toward Gaul and then into Hispania. They came not in waves of conquest, but as federates once again, granted lands by the Roman court to secure the crumbling western frontier. By the mid-5th century, under the rule of Theodoric II and Euric, the Visigoths began to shift from clients to kings. They expanded from their original center in Toulouse, conquering vast swaths of Gaul from the Loire to the Pyrenees, and pressing deep into the Iberian Peninsula. With the collapse of Roman authority, they filled the vacuum, taking cities, appointing judges, and collecting taxes. But it was in Hispania, rugged and old, that they would truly take root. In 507, a decisive moment came. At the Battle of Vui, the Visigoths clashed with the Franks under Clovis. Euric's son, King Alaric II, was slain, and the Visigoths were driven from most of Gaul. Their capital at Toulouse was lost. But the setback became a turning point. Rather than collapse, the Visigoths shifted south, across the mountains, into Hispania. There, among the remnants of Roman roads and Iberian hills, they built a kingdom more stable than any they had known before. Toledo, at the heart of the plateau, became their new center, a city not of grandeur, but of strategic strength. From its stone streets, a new Gothic order began to emerge. The Visigoths ruled as a warrior elite, distinct from the Hispano-Roman population they governed. Their language was Gothic, their laws tribal, and their faith Arian, a deep rift from the Nicene Christianity of the majority. Tensions flared. Rebellion sparked. Roman aristocrats chafed under Gothic dominance. Yet over time, the lines began to blur. Kings like Leovigild sought to unify, not only territory, but belief and law. He crushed rivals, codified customs, and expanded southward, bringing nearly all of Hispania under Gothic control. His son, Reccared would go further. In 589, in a moment of deep consequence, Reccared renounced Arianism and embraced Nicene Christianity. The conversion was both personal and political, a gesture to unify his subjects, to end division, and to join the Visigothic crown with the faith of the land. It worked. The Church, long estranged, now stood beside the throne. Councils in Toledo began to guide not only doctrine, but law. The Visigothic kingdom, once a foreign imposition, was becoming a native institution. Yet even in this moment of stability, shadows lingered. The kings remained elective, chosen by nobles, not inherited by blood. Factionalism brewed. Ambition turned to intrigue. Assassination, betrayal, and rebellion would plague the dynasty. Still, a new chapter had begun. From the ruins of empire, the Visigoths had built a kingdom, not Roman, not Gothic, but something between. They ruled a land ancient and fierce, with a sword in one hand and scripture in the other. And for over a century, their banners would fly above the high plains of Spain. The Visigothic kingdom in Hispania endured not only through the strength of arms, but through the weaving of two powerful threads, faith and law. After Reccared's dramatic conversion to Nicene Christianity in 589, the spiritual fabric of the kingdom began to shift. The Arian bishops, once central to Gothic identity, either converted or were replaced. The Council of Toledo, a gathering of bishops and nobles, became not just a religious forum, but a political force. In these councils, the Visigothic kings and Catholic clergy forged a new unity. The Church no longer stood apart, as it had under the Arian kings. It stood alongside the monarchy, helping to legitimize its rule and, in time, guide its laws. This alignment brought both strength and scrutiny. Kings who embraced orthodoxy gained divine authority, but they also faced moral expectation. Heresy, rebellion, and corruption became not only crimes against the crown, but sins against God. The law itself began to evolve. Earlier Gothic codes, tribal, oral, and warrior-based, gave way to something more structured. The Lex Visigothorum, also known as the Liber Judiciorum, emerged in the 7th century as a unified legal code. Drafted under kings like Chindasuinth and Rexwinth, it marked a turning point in European legal history. It was written in Latin, not Gothic, the language of the Church, of law, and of enduring administration. It applied not only to Goths, but to the Hispano-Roman population as well. For the first time, there was one law for all subjects, regardless of origin. This was revolutionary. No longer were the Visigoths simply a foreign elite ruling a native populace. They were, in law at least, a united people, bound by common rules, rights, and responsibilities. The Liber Judiciorum addressed not only theft and murder, but inheritance, marriage, contracts, and the treatment of slaves. It reflected a society at once Roman in form and Gothic in memory, a kingdom that had grown roots, and now sought permanence. Faith and law worked hand in hand. Bishops held sway in local affairs. Monasteries became centers of learning and charity. Royal councils debated theology alongside taxation. The boundaries between secular and sacred blurred, as they would throughout medieval Christendom. Yet this blending also bore tension. The Visigothic nobility, while bound by law, remained fiercely independent. Kings relied on their loyalty, but feared their ambition. The Church, now powerful, could shelter rebels or anoint rivals. And the very unity that Reccared had sought came with new expectations, that the king not only govern, but govern justly, and in God's name. Still, for nearly a century, this balance held. Visigothic Spain was not a golden age in splendor, but it was a realm of structure, with courts, councils, scribes, and shepherds. Its laws would influence later Spanish kingdoms. Its church would endure through conquest. And its legacy, of forging identity from faith and law, would echo long after the banners had fallen. Though the Visigothic kingdom in Hispania stood firm in law and faith, its greatest weakness lay in its crown. Unlike many monarchies, the Visigothic kingship was not strictly hereditary. Kings were elected, chosen by the nobility, sometimes confirmed by the clergy. In theory, this allowed for merit and consensus. In practice, it bred ambition, suspicion, and bloodshed. Power passed not smoothly from father to son, but through negotiation, rebellion, and often murder. Noble houses competed for influence. Bishops whispered in royal ears. Generals weighed loyalty against opportunity. In such a world, trust was rare, and kinship no shield. The result was a cycle of instability. Few kings died peacefully. Some were overthrown, others assassinated. From the late 6th century onward, the Visigothic throne saw constant upheaval. Rival factions rose and fell. Some kings ruled for decades, others for mere months. Wamba, who reigned from 672 to 680, was one of the rare strong monarchs. He repelled internal revolts, launched campaigns against the Basques, and enforced discipline within both court and church. Yet even he fell, not in battle, but to palace intrigue. Drugged, tonsured, and declared unfit to rule, he was quietly replaced by Erwig, who claimed legitimacy by religious decree. Such episodes were not unusual. Haircutting and forced monasticism became political tools to remove rivals without blood, but with finality. And yet, despite this turbulence, the kingdom endured. The nobility, for all its rivalry, still valued continuity. The Church, now deeply embedded in governance, worked to contain violence. Councils in Toledo passed decrees on succession, loyalty, and the punishment of treason. But enforcement depended on the very kings it sought to restrain. In this world of shifting crowns, strength was essential. A weak king invited rebellion. A strong one, like Chindasuinth, ruled with iron, executing rivals, centralizing power, and leaving behind a realm more stable, if more feared. Still, the threat was not always within. On the fringes of the kingdom, the seeds of greater danger stirred. In the south, the Visigoths eyed the fading Byzantine outposts with suspicion. In the north, the Basques resisted control. And far beyond the sea, in the desert of Arabia, a new faith was rising, one that would soon sweep across continents. But for now, the Visigoths turned inward, nobles plotting, bishops convening, kings watching their backs even as they ruled from gilded thrones. their laws were fair, their faith devout. But their throne was fragile, and it would soon fall. By the early 8th century, the Visigothic kingdom stood weary and exposed. Though still vast in land, it had grown brittle in structure. Its laws remained, its councils convened, but its throne was ever at risk, not from foreign armies, but from noble ambition and internal fracture. In 710, King Witiza died, leaving the kingdom divided. His supporters claimed his son, Aquila, should inherit. But the nobles, weary of hereditary rule and eager to assert their voice, elevated a rival, Roderick, a military commander and man of ambition. The kingdom split. Aquila held the northeast. Roderick, the south and west, including Toledo. The fracture was not yet civil war, but it was tension, and it came at the worst possible moment. Across the Strait of Gibraltar, a new force stirred. The Muslim armies of North Africa, under the banner of the Umayyad Caliphate, had already swept across the Maghreb, defeating Berber kingdoms and Byzantine garrisons. Now, they turned their eyes north, toward Hispania. It was not at first a grand invasion. In 711, a small force led by the Berber general Rik ibn Ziyad crossed the sea with perhaps 7,000 men. They landed near Gibraltar, a name that would forever echo his presence, Jabal Rik, the Mountain of Rik. What followed remained shrouded in both history and legend. Roderick, upon learning of the landing, mustered his army and marched south. The two forces met near the Guadalete River, not far from the coast, in the sweltering summer of that year. The battle was fierce, but short. Roderick's army was betrayed. Some nobles, perhaps loyal to Witiza's line or wary of Roderick's power, held back or defected. Others fled. Roderick himself perished, his body never found. The Gothic host dissolved. The Muslim force, surprised by the ease of victory, pressed forward. City after city fell, Écija, Córdoba, Toledo. Some offered resistance. Others surrendered, hoping for tolerance, and often receiving it. Local populations, worn down by noble feuds and taxation, sometimes welcomed new rulers who promised peace and allowed them to keep their faith for a tax. Within just a few years, the Visigothic kingdom lay in ruins. Pockets of resistance remained in the north, in the mountains of Asturias and beyond. There, a small Gothic remnant would gather, and in time, sow the seeds of Christian reconquest. But the kingdom, as it had stood, was no more. Its fall was not due to conquest alone. It was pride, division, and blindness to change. The Gothic kings had unified law and faith, but failed to unify power. Their nobles, ever watchful of their own estates, undermined the very crown they needed. And when the storm came, they stood apart, and fell together. Thus ended the rule of the Visigoths in Spain, not with the roar of defiance, but with the silence of broken unity. The banners of Toledo were lowered. A new era had begun. Though their kingdoms crumbled, the Goths did not vanish. Their names would fade from maps, their banners torn down, but echoes of their presence would linger, in lore, in memory, and in the very foundations of the societies that rose from their ruins. In Spain, the Visigothic heritage seeped into the soil of the Reconquista. The Christian kingdoms that emerged in the north, Asturias, Leon, Castile, often traced their legitimacy to Visigothic roots. Pelagius, the founder of the Asturian kingdom, was styled as a descendant of Gothic nobles. His victory at Covadonga in 722 was cast not just as a military triumph, but as the beginning of Gothic restoration. The idea took hold that the Christian monarchs of Iberia were heirs of Toledo, guardians of a lost order. This myth of continuity gave moral weight to centuries of reconquest, framing it not as conquest anew, but as reclamation. The Visigothic legal tradition, too, endured. The Liber Judiciorum, codified in the 7th century, remained influential long after the kingdom's fall. In Asturias, Leon, and later Castile, it was recoped, commented upon, and used as a foundation for local law. Its blend of Roman legalism and Gothic custom shaped medieval Spanish jurisprudence. Ecclesiastically, the councils of Toledo served as a model for later church councils, places where doctrine and royal authority were jointly discussed. The idea of a king ruling not alone, but in dialogue with bishops and nobles, would persist across Christendom. Elsewhere in Europe, the Gothic legacy was subtler, but present. In Italy, the memory of Theodoric the Great endured. Though his kingdom had fallen, his reputation as a just ruler survived, preserved in letters, chronicles, and even legends. The Lombards who followed adopted parts of his administrative model. Charlemagne himself would later draw from Theodoric's vision, a Germanic ruler seated on Roman foundations. Even in language and architecture, whispers remained. The term Gothic, centuries later, would be revived, not as a people, but as a style. Medieval scholars, looking upon soaring cathedrals with pointed arches and intricate tracery, called them Gothic, associating the grandeur with a barbarian past, though mistakenly. The name stuck, reshaped by time and taste. In truth, the Goths left no permanent empire, no singular cultural empire like Rome's. But they left an example of a people who sought to bridge the old and the new, to rule not merely by conquest, but by adaptation. They translated scripture into their tongue, held councils with bishops, governed by written law. They fell, yes, but not without shaping the ground upon which others would stand. Their story became part of the great European tapestry, a thread darkened by loss, but still woven into the cloth. Among the many legacies the Goths carried through the centuries, one stands apart not for power or conquest, but for the quiet endurance of language. The Gothic tongue, an East Germanic language, was once spoken from the Baltic shores to the Danubian plains. It was not the language of Cicero or Caesar, but it had rhythm, weight, and poetry of its own. It bore the songs of warriors, the oaths of kings, and, through one man, the word of Scripture. His name was Ulfila, or Wulfila, meaning little wolf. Born in the early 4th century, likely of mixed Gothic and Cappadocian heritage, Ulfila was raised among the Tervingi Goths and ordained as a bishop under the patronage of the Roman Empire. Arian in belief, Ulfila carried not only doctrine but literacy to his people. He saw that conversion required not just preaching, but understanding. And so he undertook a task of monumental devotion, to translate the Bible into Gothic. But the Goths had no written script of their own. So Ulfila created one. Drawing on Greek, Latin, and perhaps a hint of runic influence, he crafted the Gothic alphabet, 27 characters to capture the sounds of his people's speech. With it, he rendered sacred text into Gothic for the first time. The result was the Wulfila Bible, or, as scholars later called it, the Codex Argenteus. Only fragments survive today, most famously in the 6th century silver-bound manuscript held in Uppsala. Written in silver and gold ink on purple-dyed vellum, it is not merely a holy book, but a relic of cultural rebirth. The language preserved in its pages is the oldest substantial record of any Germanic tongue. It offers a window into how the Goths spoke, thought, and prayed, a language alive with compound words, strong consonants, and an earthy beauty. From its verses, we glimpse a world where scripture passed not through Latin cloisters, but through Gothic voices. Fader unser u in himmelem, wane namo ein. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Wulfila's work was more than translation. It was transformation. It brought literacy to the Goths, shaped their religious identity, and gave permanence to their language. Yet the language, like the kingdom, would not endure. By the 9th century, Gothic was fading. As the people were absorbed into new societies, Hispanic, Italian, or Slavic, their tongue gave way. Only in distant Crimea did it linger a little longer, among a Gothic enclave isolated from the wider fall. Still, the voice of the Goths was not lost. It lives on in the Codex, in the carved letters of Wulfila's alphabet, and in the echoes it left in the languages that followed. It reminds us that even in a world of swords and cities, words can endure, and that a quiet bishop, seated among barbarians, gave them a voice to speak with heaven. Before Alaric led his people to the gates of Rome, and before Theodoric carved a kingdom in Italy, there was a time when the Goths bowed, not to emperors, but to horse lords from the steppe. The arrival of the Huns in the late 4th century sent shockwaves through the Gothic world. Swift, brutal, and relentless, the Huns swept westward from the grasslands beyond the Volga, displacing Alans, Sarmatians, and finally the Greuthungi, the Eastern Goths. Their riders were like nothing the Goths had ever faced, bow-legged, skull-shaped by cranial binding, and masters of mounted warfare. They struck without warning and vanished before resistance could rally. Faced with annihilation, the Greuthungi broke. Their king, Ermanaric, once ruler of a vast Gothic realm across the steppe, either took his life or was overthrown as panic gripped his people. The survivors fled westward, seeking protection among the Tervingi or sanctuary within Roman lands. But not all escaped. Many Goths, especially among the eastern branches, fell under Hunnic domination. They were not obliterated, they were absorbed. As the Huns built their confederation, they brought with them not just warriors, but subjugated peoples, Germans, Alans, Slavs, and Goths. Under Hunnic rule, Gothic life changed. They fought in Hunnic wars, often against other Gothic tribes. They became known as foederati of a different kind, bound not by treaty, but by fear. Some rose as auxiliaries and lieutenants within the Hunnic army. Others served as foot soldiers or hostage nobles, their loyalty ensured by the threat of reprisals. In this crucible, a strange blend formed. Goths learned Hunnic tactics. They rode more, adopted composite bows, and witnessed a new kind of mobile warfare. At the same time, they retained parts of their identity, their language, their customs, and in some cases, their Christianity. When Attila rose in the 440s, the Goths stood within his shadow. He used them as vassals, deploying them in his vast campaigns across Gaul and the Balkans. At the Battle of the Catalonian Plains in 451, the last great clash of the ancient world, Gothic warriors stood on both sides, some under Attila, others under the Roman Gothic alliance led by Theodoric I of the Visigoths. Theodoric fell in battle, but the Huns were halted. And then, suddenly, they were gone. Attila died in 453, perhaps from a nosebleed on his wedding night, or perhaps by poison. His sons quarreled. The Hunnic Empire fractured. And at the Battle of Nedao in 454, the subject peoples, including many Goths, rose up and threw off their chains. The Ostrogoths, long captive, regained their independence. Among them was Theodemir, father of Theodoric the Great, who would lead his people from Hunnic servitude to royal dominion. Thus ended the Gothic chapter under Hunnic rule, not with extinction, but with transformation. They had suffered, endured, and learned. And from their time in shadow, they emerged sharper, war-hardened, and ready to carve their own path once more. The story of the Goths is not only one of migration and war, but of faith, and the choices they made within a divided Christian world. In the early 4th century, as Christianity spread across the Roman Empire, a theological dispute erupted at its heart. The question was profound: what was the true nature of Christ? Was he of the same essence as God the Father, or merely similar? Out of this debate rose Arianism, named after Arius, a priest from Alexandria. Arius taught that Christ was divine, but not co-eternal with the Father. He was begotten, subordinate, a creation of God, not God himself. It was a teaching that appealed to many, especially among those outside the imperial elite. It emphasized the hierarchy of heaven and seemed more accessible to newcomers to the faith. The Council of Nicaea in 325 condemned Arianism as heresy. But the doctrine lingered, especially in the eastern provinces, and among the Gothic tribes newly encountering Christianity. It was Ulfila, the same bishop who translated the Bible into Gothic, who brought Arianism to the Goths. Raised in Cappadocia, ordained in Constantinople, Ulfila was himself an Arian, and it was this form of Christianity that he preached among his people. And they embraced it. For over 2 centuries, the Goths remained steadfast Arians. It became not just a matter of theology, but of identity. To be Gothic was to believe in Christ the Son, but in the way of Arius, not of Nicaea. This distinction mattered deeply. As the Goths moved into Roman lands, settling in Italy, Gaul, and Spain, they found themselves surrounded by Nicene Christians. The clergy, the cities, the Roman populace, all viewed Arianism as a dangerous heresy. This created deep tension. Gothic rulers, though Christian, were alien in faith. They built separate churches. Their bishops were excluded from Roman councils. In cities like Ravenna and Toledo, one could see Arian basilicas beside Catholic cathedrals, silent symbols of division. Some rulers, like Theodoric the Great, managed this divide with tolerance. He protected Catholic subjects while keeping Arianism as the court religion. But others struggled. In Visigothic Spain, the divide became a source of unrest, undermining unity and deepening mistrust between the Gothic elite and the Roman population. The turning point came in 589. At the Third Council of Toledo, King Rekhard I publicly renounced Arianism and converted to Nicene Christianity. His announcement stunned the realm. Bishops wept. Nobles debated. But the effect was lasting. Arian churches were reconsecrated. Gothic bishops either converted or were displaced. For the first time, the kingdom stood united, not just in territory, but in creed. And yet, something was lost. With the passing of Arianism, the Goths surrendered one of the last markers of their distinct identity. Their faith became Roman. Their tongue faded. Their kings, though still Gothic by name, now knelt before Roman altars. Arianism itself would disappear, surviving for a time among other Germanic peoples, like the Vandals and Lombards, but eventually fading into history. Still, the story of the Goths and Arianism remains a powerful reminder. That faith is not just belief, it is belonging. And in the Gothic world, theology was more than doctrine. It was destiny. When one hears the term Gothic architecture today, images arise of soaring cathedrals, pointed arches, and rose windows, masterpieces of the High Middle Ages. But these are not the works of the Goths themselves. Rather, they bear a name given by later critics, who saw such styles as barbarous, Gothic in the sense of rude or Roman. The true art and architecture of the historical Goths, both Visigothic and Ostrogothic, was far more restrained, yet rich with meaning. It grew from their position as inheritors of Rome and carriers of their own traditions, rooted in movement, memory, and belief. In Italy, under Theodoric the Great, Gothic building reached its zenith. Though Theodoric respected Roman traditions, he also wished to signal his legitimacy as ruler. His court in Ravenna became a place of quiet architectural brilliance. There, he constructed churches, mausoleums, and palaces, blending Roman forms with Gothic symbols. The Basilica of Sant'Apollinare Nuovo, for example, bears majestic mosaics commissioned under Theodoric. Though later altered, traces of his presence remain: golden processions, formal figures, and rows of Gothic warriors standing tall in ceremonial armor. The Mausoleum of Theodoric, his final resting place, is one of the few indisputably Gothic structures still standing. Built around 520, it is austere, circular, and capped with a massive single stone roof, weighing over 300 tons. It does not mimic Roman grandeur, but asserts something else: permanence through simplicity, power through solidity. In Visigothic Spain, the artistic legacy took a different form. Here, too, the Goths built churches, small, often isolated structures with horseshoe arches, thick walls, and minimal decoration. They were places of worship, yes, but also of refuge and identity. San Juan de Bonias and Santa Comba de Band are two of the oldest surviving examples, humble in scale, but rich in historical weight. Visigothic sculpture was often focused on symbolism rather than realism. Carvings on lintels and capitals reveal intricate interlace patterns, stylized animals, and Christian iconography, a fusion of late Roman motifs and Germanic abstraction. The use of the cross was constant, but often uniquely Gothic in shape and design, bearing witness to their distinct interpretation of the faith. Metalwork, too, was a Gothic strength. From fibulae, brooches, to sword fittings, Gothic artisans created detailed, finely worked items, often inlaid with garnets, glass, or colored stones. These items were not mere ornaments, but signs of status, loyalty, and memory. They carried with them the stories of tribes, families, and warriors. In all, Gothic art was not about overwhelming the senses. It was about presence, the quiet, enduring mark of a people who stood at the crossroads of empire and migration, of tradition and transformation. And though their kingdoms fell, their architecture remains, not in grandeur, but in grace. Stone by stone, they told their story. Beneath the swirl of battles and crowns, Gothic life pulsed in quieter spaces, farms and courtyards, kitchens and cloisters, where women held the fabric of family together. Though rarely named in chronicles, Gothic women played crucial roles in sustaining their people. As daughters, wives, mothers, and even regents, they shaped identity, nurtured tradition, and, at times, steered the fate of kingdoms. Marriage was central. Among the Goths, marriage was not only a personal union but a political and social bond. Marriages joined clans, settled disputes, and solidified alliances. Bride price was customary, a token of the husband's responsibility and respect, though arranged matches often prioritized family interests over affection. Once married, a Gothic woman held authority within the household. She managed food stores, textile production, and domestic rituals. She oversaw servants or slaves, instructed children, and sometimes helped settle minor disputes. The home, whether in a village or near the court, was her realm, practical and respected. Children were many. Mortality was high. Gothic families valued sons for strength and labor, but daughters were not ignored. Girls were taught the ways of the household and often educated in faith, especially as the church gained influence. Some entered religious life, where they gained unusual autonomy as nuns, abbesses, or patrons of learning. Among the nobility, women could wield power. Gothic queens, such as Amalasuntha of the Ostrogoths, sometimes ruled in their own right or acted as regents for underage sons. Amalasuntha, in particular, governed with intelligence and Roman elegance, promoting education and diplomacy. Her reign, though ultimately cut short by betrayal, left a vivid impression of Gothic female leadership. Widowhood, too, could elevate a woman's standing. A widowed noblewoman might retain her husband's estate, oversee dependents, or enter the church. Some became patrons of monasteries or protectors of their kin. In rare cases, they mediated between rival factions or sponsored religious councils. Law offered both limits and protections. The Liber Judiciorum, the great Visigothic law code, contained detailed provisions regarding women, inheritance rights, marriage contracts, protection against abuse, and penalties for crimes. While still patriarchal, it recognized female agency in ways that echoed Roman precedent and foreshadowed later medieval reforms. Religion deepened women's roles. Christian devotion provided new paths for influence, especially as the Church expanded literacy and charitable work. Women supported monastic foundations, preserved relics, and nurtured the spiritual life of their households. The blending of Gothic tradition with Christian practice created new spaces for female authority. And yet, most Gothic women lived and died unseen by scribes, shepherding children, baking bread, tending goats, and telling stories by firelight. They carried language in lullabies, faith in gesture, and memory in silence. Through them, customs endured. Through them, the future was born. The tale of the Goths is often told in Swords and Kings. But beneath it all, it was women who made the world whole. War was the forge in which Gothic identity was tempered. From the frozen shores of the Baltic to the sun-scorched plains of Hispania, the Goths were rarely far from conflict, and over centuries, they honed the art of survival and conquest. In their earliest days, Gothic warfare was tribal, fluid, mobile, and personal. War bands were small, built around kinship or loyalty to a local chieftain. Warriors fought on foot or horseback, wielding spears, swords, and small round shields. Their tactics emphasized ambush, mobility, and bravery. Glory was earned not by orders, but by deeds, and a leader's strength was measured by the warriors willing to follow him. Armor was scarce. A few nobles might possess chainmail or iron helms, but most relied on leather, furs, and speed. Their strength lay in knowledge of terrain, in bold strikes, and in fierce morale. But contact with Rome, both as enemy and ally, transformed them. By the 4th century, Gothic warriors had begun serving in Roman armies as foederati. There, they encountered the discipline of the legions, the structure of command, and the value of siegecraft and fortification. They adapted swiftly. By the time of Alaric, Gothic armies moved like organized hosts, with supplied trains, scouts, and battle formations. Cavalry grew in prominence, especially among the Visigoths. Gothic heavy cavalry, clad in mail and wielding long swords or lances, became formidable shock troops. The Ostrogoths, shaped by their time under the Huns, placed even greater emphasis on mounted warfare. They mastered fast, coordinated strikes and the use of composite bows, tactics inherited from their steppe overlords. The result was a fusion of Gothic valor and nomadic agility. In defense, the Goths proved tenacious. At sieges, they employed Roman techniques, towers, battering rams, and tunnels. Cities like Rome, Milan, and Ravenna bore witness to their persistence. Yet they also understood the value of negotiation, surrounding a city not merely to conquer, but to demand tribute, terms, or recognition. Leadership in Gothic warfare was personal and charismatic. Kings led from the front, earning loyalty through courage. The deaths of Theodoric I at the Catalonian plains and Totila at Tagini showed that Gothic rulers shared the risks of battle. This bred loyalty, but also danger, for the fall of a leader could break an army's resolve. Still, their warriors were not mere raiders. They carried with them families, elders, and livestock, a migrating people, not just an army. This made them slow to move at times, but also relentless. They did not retreat easily, for there was no home to return to, only the promise of a homeland ahead. Their strength lay not in numbers or equipment, but in resilience. Whether resisting Hunnic domination, sacking Rome, or defending Hispania against the Franks, the Goths showed adaptability, blending old customs with new tools, and never ceasing to learn from their foes. They were not conquerors by design, but survivors by necessity. And when they struck with the weight of a people behind them. The migration period, that age of movement, collision, and change, was the crucible in which the Gothic story was shaped. Between the 3rd and 6th centuries, the Goths crossed more than lands. They crossed boundaries of culture, faith, and history. Their journey began in mystery. Origin legends placed them on the island of Skansa, likely Scandinavia, from where they moved southward under a leader named Berig. Archaeology supports a migration along the Vistula River and into the Pontic steppe by the 3rd century. There, the Goths flourished, dividing into two major groups, the Tervingi and the Greuthungi. They encountered the Roman world not as invaders at first, but as neighbors, sometimes raiding, sometimes trading. But contact deepened. They crossed the Danube, settled near Roman borders, and slowly felt the pull of empire. Then came the Huns. In the 370s, the arrival of these mounted warriors from the east shattered Gothic stability. The Greuthungi collapsed. The Tervingi fled. One fateful year, 376, marked a turning point, when the Gothic leader Fritigern asked the Eastern Roman Emperor Valens for permission to cross the Danube with his people. It was granted. Tens of thousands entered the empire, seeking refuge. But mismanagement, corruption, and hunger turned hope into revolt. 2 years later, in 378, the Goths won a stunning victory at the Battle of Adrianople, killing Emperor Valens and shaking the Roman world to its core. This was not mere rebellion. It was a migration with force. In the following decades, the Goths continued their journey, not aimlessly, but with a collective will. Under Alaric, they marched through the Balkans, into Italy, and finally to Rome. Under Atholf, they crossed into Gaul and then into Hispania. Meanwhile, the Ostrogoths, after their liberation from Hunnic rule, moved westward under Theodoric. They traversed Pannonia, crossed the Alps, and took Italy, forging a kingdom upon Roman soil. Each step of this journey was marked by struggle and adaptation. The Goths did not simply impose their ways. They negotiated, learned, and changed. They became Roman in dress, Christian in faith, and literate in Latin. Yet they held to their king groups, their names, and their warrior pride. The migration period was not a chaotic invasion. It was a passage, forced by fear, driven by need, shaped by ambition. For the Goths, it was both loss and opportunity. They left behind their old lands, languages, and freedoms. But they gained kingdoms, churches, and memory. And though their rule would not last, their journey reshaped the world they entered. By the end of the migration period, the map of Europe had changed, and the Goths had walked its roads from sea to sea. In the early centuries, the Goths lived by unwritten customs, oaths, kin loyalty, and tribal honor. Justice was personal. Vengeance was lawful. Authority lay in the hands of chieftains, guided more by tradition than decree. But as they settled in Roman lands, a transformation began. The Goths, once outside the law of empire, now ruled it. And they needed their own. What emerged over time was not a rejection of Roman legalism, but a merging. The Gothic kingdoms, especially in Spain, began to write down their laws, blending tribal precedent with Roman forms. It was a quiet revolution, one that laid groundwork for future European law. The most significant fruit of this effort was the Liber Judiciorum. First compiled under King Rexwinth in the mid-7th century, and developed from earlier codes by Leovigild and Chindasuinth, the Liber Judiciorum, Book of Judgments, was more than a law book. It was a statement that the Visigothic kingdom was orderly, sovereign, and unified. It contained nearly 600 laws, written in Latin, the language of learning, governance, and the Church. Unlike earlier codes, it applied not only to the Goths but to all subjects of the realm, including the Hispano-Roman population. In it, one finds laws on theft, murder, and property disputes, marriage, inheritance, and legitimacy, clerical conduct and church rights, servitude, manumission, and the treatment of slaves. The code balanced mercy with justice. Penalties often involved fines or restitution rather than execution. Oaths and witness testimony were central. A man standing, noble, free, or servile, shaped his legal rights and obligations. But beyond detail, the Liber reflected a political vision. It reinforced royal authority. Kings were portrayed not merely as war leaders, but as guardians of justice. They convened councils, approved revisions, and acted as the highest judges. The law gave the crown legitimacy and a bond with its subjects. Governance under the Goths was similarly structured. At court, the king ruled with the council of nobles and bishops. Royal officials administered provinces, collected taxes, and oversaw justice. The Church, closely tied to the crown after Richard's conversion, played an active role, both spiritual and administrative. In cities, local governance blended Roman municipal traditions with Gothic oversight. In the countryside, lords held sway over estates, but were subject to royal law. The councils of Toledo, regular assemblies of clergy and lay leaders, were especially influential. They debated doctrine, but also succession, taxation, and civil law. In them, the ideals of a Christian monarchy were born, where kings ruled not by sword alone, but by sacred duty. And though the Gothic kingdoms would fall, their legal legacy endured. The Liber Judiciorum influenced later Iberian law, carried forward into the codes of Asturias, Leon, and Castile. Its spirit, that of a written, reasoned law for all, echoed long after Gothic names faded from the rolls of kings. In governance, as in battle, the Goths adapted. And in law, they found not only control, but continuity. Though remembered as warriors and kings, the Goths were also farmers, merchants, and stewards of land. Their survival did not rest solely on the sword, but also on grain, livestock, and trade routes stretching across old Roman roads. In their early days along the Danube and Black Sea, the Goths lived by mixed subsistence, agriculture, herding, and raiding. They traded with both Roman provinces and steppe peoples. Amber from the Baltic, furs, and slaves were exchanged for Roman wine, metalwork, and coins. The Danube frontier, though violent, was also porous, a place of both conflict and commerce. As the Goths settled in Roman lands, their economic life deepened. They took over estates, towns, and fortresses. In Italy under Theodoric, and in Spain under the Visigoths, they inherited not only land, but the infrastructure of Roman administration, roads, aqueducts, granaries, and ports. They did not dismantle this world, they maintained it, and where possible, revived it. Theodoric the Great famously ordered repairs to roads and aqueducts, ensured grain shipments to Rome, and regulated prices in the marketplace. His rule sought to protect trade, both within Italy and with the Eastern Roman Empire. Gothic kings recognized that prosperity required more than conquest. In Visigothic Spain, agriculture formed the economic backbone. Wheat, olives, and grapes dominated the fields. Sheep and cattle provided meat, wool, and hides. Local markets bustled with artisans, blacksmiths, weavers, potters, and merchants. Trade existed at multiple levels. Local trade connected villages and towns. Regional trade moved goods across provinces. And long-distance trade, though diminished from Roman heights, still brought goods from Byzantium, North Africa, and Frankish Gaul. Coins circulated, especially Roman and Byzantine issues. The Goths minted their own as well, often imitating Roman style, using Latin inscriptions, and bearing images of emperors or crosses. These coins served not just economic function, but political messaging, a claim to legitimacy, continuity, and order. Guilds and associations may have persisted, especially in larger towns. Taxes were collected in coin or in kind. Land was granted to nobles in return for military service, but could also be farmed by peasants, some of whom lived as coloni, bound to the land, but not enslaved. Slavery, though reduced, still existed. War captives, debtors, and others formed a lower class of servile labor. The church sometimes intervened on their behalf, encouraging manumission or setting conditions for humane treatment. But the economy remained stratified. The Visigothic law codes reflect this order. They outline rules for contracts, property rights, theft, and labor disputes. They regulated trade weights, protected vineyards, and even addressed the rights of traveling merchants. A world of rules, not just raids. Yet despite this structure, Gothic economies faced challenges. Plagues, poor harvests, and war disrupted trade. Internal strife drained resources. And as central authority weakened, local lords began to dominate, leading to economic fragmentation. Still, the image of the Goths as mere destroyers is false. They tilled soil, taxed cities, built roads, and minted coins. They lived in a world of exchange of goods, people, and ideas. And in doing so, they helped carry the ancient world forward into the medieval. To know a people fully, one must also hear the voices of those who watched them from across borders, sometimes in admiration, more often in fear. The Goths loomed large in the minds of their neighbors, especially in Constantinople and among the Franks of Gaul. In the Byzantine East, the Goths were both menace and mirror. They had once slain an emperor, Valens at Adrianople, and shaken the empire to its core. They had marched through its provinces, sacked its cities, and carved kingdoms from its ruins. Yet over time, they also became part of its orbit. Theodoric the Great had spent his youth as a hostage in Constantinople. He spoke Greek, admired Roman culture, and governed his kingdom in Italy with deference to imperial customs. The Eastern court often treated Gothic rulers as foederati or honorary consuls, acknowledging their power while insisting on theoretical subordination. This uneasy relationship turned to hostility under Emperor Justinian. To Constantinople, the Gothic kingdom in Italy was an aberration, a usurpation of rightful Roman rule. Justinian's wars, launched in the mid-6th century, were framed not merely as conquest but as renovatio imperii, the restoration of empire. Gothic resistance, no matter how legitimate, was painted as rebellion. Byzantine historians such as Procopius portrayed the Goths with complexity. They were brave, organized, and sometimes noble, but also seen as interlopers, a shadow of the true Roman order. In the Wars of Justinian, Procopius describes Gothic leaders with a mix of respect and disdain, often admiring their courage while mourning the devastation their conflicts caused. To the Franks, the view was more direct. Clovis, the Frankish king who defeated the Visigoths at Veii in 507, saw them not as allies or rivals, but as enemies. His conversion to Nicene Christianity, in contrast to the Arian faith of the Goths, gave his wars a spiritual edge. He presented himself as the protector of orthodoxy and the avenger of Roman Christians under Gothic rule. Frankish chronicles often depicted the Goths as proud, aloof, and foreign. Gregory of Tours, the great 6th century historian of Gaul, described them as heretics and outsiders, different in tongue, law, and belief. Yet he could not ignore their power. His writings suggest a grudging respect for their discipline and the might of their armies, even as he celebrated their defeat. In both East and West, the Goths were remembered as transitional. They were not quite Roman, yet not wholly barbarian. They lived within the ruins of empire, preserving its forms while altering its spirit. To Byzantine eyes, they were usurpers. To Frankish minds, they were foils, against which the new Christian monarchies defined themselves. And yet, with the passage of time, the sharp edges softened. Later medieval chroniclers began to see the Goths as part of a lost golden age. In Spain, Gothic rule was remembered with nostalgia, a time before the fall, before the Caliphate, before the long war of reconquest. Thus, even in the judgment of others, the Goths endured, not only in what they did, but in how they were remembered. A people caught between worlds, both feared and emulated, both lost and longed for. Though the Goths have long since vanished as a people, their presence lingers, not in armies or banners, but in customs, place names, and the silent bones of cities they once ruled. In Spain, the shadow of the Visigoths is perhaps deepest. Toledo, their ancient capital, still stands, a city of winding streets, Gothic churches, and layered memory. Though much of its Visigothic architecture has been overlaid by later Christian and Muslim styles, remnants survive in hidden chapels, inscriptions, and museum pieces. Archaeologists have uncovered Visigothic jewelry, carved lintels, and church foundations, often marked by the distinctive horseshoe arch, a form that later became iconic in Islamic architecture. Some scholars argue that this arch, first seen in Visigothic churches like San Juan de Bonias, helped inspire the later elegance of the Great Mosque of Córdoba. Language holds echoes too. While the Gothic tongue itself is extinct, certain words, especially in legal or rural vocabulary, may trace their roots to Gothic origin. Terms related to landholding, inheritance, or village administration sometimes show a Germanic twist beneath their Latin shell. More significantly, the legal tradition of the Visigoths, the Liber Judiciorum, influenced the Fuero Juzgo, a medieval Castilian law code used well into the 13th century. This continuity gave Spain a rare link between the Roman era and the emerging Christian kingdoms. In festivals and folklore, too, faint echoes remain. Some local legends, especially in Castile and Leon, speak of Gothic kings, hidden treasures, or noble lineages tracing back to Toledo. These are not historically precise, but they reflect cultural memory, a longing for connection to an age before Moorish rule, when Spain was still Gothic and whole. In Italy, the memory of the Ostrogoths is more architectural than popular. Ravenna preserves their legacy best. The Mausoleum of Theodoric, with its massive monolithic roof, still stands in stoic silence. Nearby, the mosaics of Sant'Apollinare Nuovo once showed Theodoric and his court, though later Byzantine rulers attempted to erase these images, a testament to how potent his memory was. Elsewhere in Italy, place names and Roman roads once repaired under Gothic oversight remain in quiet use. Though the Ostrogothic kingdom was short-lived, its role in preserving Roman administration and law in the post-imperial years was profound. And in both countries, Christianity bears Gothic fingerprints. The integration of church and state, honed under Visigothic kings and solidified in the councils of Toledo, shaped the model of Christian monarchy in medieval Spain. In Italy, the Gothic legacy of tolerance under Theodoric influenced debates on religious coexistence, even as later rulers followed different paths. Thus, the Goths remain, not as invaders or monarchs, but as threads in the fabric of European heritage. In stone, law, memory, and myth, they left behind more than ruins. They left a shape of a people who came from beyond the empire, and who helped shape what came after it. To trace the Gothic journey is to follow a people forever on the threshold, between forest and city, pagan and Christian, Rome and its beyond. They were never fully of one world or another. They were, always, between. Their origins lie in fog and migration. From the northern shores of the Baltic, or perhaps the banks of the Vistula, they came southward, drawn by the promise of land, of safety, of something more. And in that long movement, identity was both preserved and reshaped. What made a Goth? It was not language alone, though Gothic speech, preserved in fragments by Ulfila, once marked them distinct. Nor was it merely kingship, for their rulers changed often, and were chosen more by strength than by bloodline. It was a way of being, mobile, resilient, deeply tied to kin and war band. They cherished memory, carried their past not in stone but in story. Even as they adopted Roman ways, laws, letters, and liturgy, they held on to something more ancient. Yet change was inevitable. They were baptized into Christianity, though Arian at first. They ruled Roman cities, issued laws in Latin, and married into senatorial families. They dressed as Romans, wrote like Romans, and sometimes called themselves Romans in law and title. Still, they were seen as other. To Roman eyes, they remained barbari, not necessarily crude, but foreign, unstable, potentially dangerous. To their own people, they were proud of their traditions, their gods turned saints, their kings who stood before emperors. Their identity, then, was layered. They were Germanic in blood, Roman in administration, Christian in soul. They were the past and the future of Europe, at once destroyers and preservers. They sacked Rome, yet upheld Roman law. They dethroned emperors, yet revered imperial dignity. This duality shaped their fate. They never formed an empire of their own, no lasting capital, no universal creed. Instead, they formed kingdoms at the margins, always under pressure, always transforming. Their identity was fluid, able to adapt, to blend, to endure. And in this, they foreshadowed much of medieval Europe. For Europe itself would become a tapestry of peoples, Franks, Lombards, Saxons, Slavs, each taking fragments of Rome and forging something new. The Goths were among the first. They showed that civilization need not perish, but could change hands. Their story is one of movement, not just across land, but across identity. From pagans to Christians. From warriors to kings. From strangers to founders. They were never entirely Roman, nor entirely other. They were, simply, the Goths. A people between worlds. Long after the Visigothic kings fell in Spain, and the Ostrogothic banners vanished from Italy, there remained a distant outpost, a small enclave clinging to the edge of the known world, where the Gothic tongue was whispered one final time. That place was Crimea. Isolated by geography, nestled along the northern shores of the Black Sea, this region had seen Goths since the 3rd century. Some had settled there even before the Hunnic invasions. Others fled there afterward, refugees from the storms that swept the west. Over centuries, these Crimean Goths became a forgotten branch of their people. They lived in small hilltop settlements, fortified and remote. They practiced Christianity, likely of the Eastern Rite, and kept to themselves. Their architecture blended Gothic, Greek, and local influences. Their faith bound them to Constantinople. Their customs tethered them to a vanished past. Remarkably, their language endured. By the 16th century, nearly 1,000 years after the fall of the Gothic kingdoms, travelers reported hearing a strange tongue spoken in isolated Crimean villages. One such visitor, the Flemish diplomat Ogier Ghislain de Busbecq, met these people while serving as ambassador to the Ottoman Empire. In 1562, Busbecq recorded a list of Gothic words, collected from a man he encountered in Constantinople. The vocabulary was simple: parts of the body, household items, animals, yet it echoed unmistakably of the Gothic preserved in Ulfilas' Bible. The dialect was roughened by time, mingled with neighboring tongues, but still alive. It was a ghost language, speaking from a vanished world. But even this final echo would fade. In the following centuries, Crimea fell under the sway of larger powers, Ottomans, Russians, and others. The small Gothic communities, already diminished by time and intermarriage, disappeared into the broader population. Their churches crumbled. Their speech was lost. And so the Gothic diaspora ended, not in violence, but in silence. Still, their memory remains. In the ruins of Mangupkale, a mountain fortress once held by the Goths, stone walls whisper their story. In Busbeck's writings, a few Gothic syllables survive. And in the wider history of the Gothic peoples, Crimea stands as a quiet coda, a reminder that even when kingdoms fall, culture can linger in the most unlikely places. The Crimean Goths were not kings or conquerors. They were caretakers, holding a small flame until the wind, at last, took it. For centuries after their fall, the Goths lay buried beneath the weight of history, remembered dimly in church records, hinted at in place names, and preserved only by the laws and stones they left behind. But time has a way of awakening old echoes. In the Renaissance, antiquarians began to rediscover the names of the Goths. They read Jordanes and Cassiodorus. They traced ruins in Italy and Spain. They marveled at the Codex Argentius, recovered in the 16th century, that shimmering, purple-dyed manuscript of Ulfila's Bible, still bearing Gothic words in silver ink. The Goths, once dismissed as barbarians, began to acquire intrigue. In Spain, scholars during the Reconquista and afterward cultivated the idea of a Gothic lineage. The Toledan legacy, a belief in unbroken descent from the Visigoths, became a point of pride, especially among nobles. Spanish kings portrayed themselves as heirs to Gothic sovereignty, reclaiming what the Moors had taken. This sense of noble ancestry continued into early modern politics. In Sweden, 17th-century thinkers claimed that their nation had descended directly from the ancient Goths. This Gothicismus movement held that the Gothic migrations had begun in Scandinavia, a theory drawn partly from Jordanes, partly from national pride. The Swedish crown embraced the myth, seeing in it a justification for imperial ambition and cultural grandeur. But it was in the 18th and 19th centuries, the age of Romanticism, that the Goths truly stirred again. Poets, painters, and historians, wearied by Enlightenment reason, turned their gaze to the medieval. They sought passion, wildness, and lost heroism. The word Gothic took on new meaning, not just historical, but aesthetic. Gothic ruins became sublime. Gothic novels, with their dark castles and brooding characters, evoked mystery and grandeur. The term, once an insult hurled at medieval architecture by Renaissance critics, was reimagined as a mark of beauty and depth. The historical Goths were swept into this current. They were portrayed as noble savages, tragic wanderers, doomed inheritors of a crumbling world. Painters depicted Alaric at the gates of Rome, Theodoric on his marble throne. Historians, especially in Germany, explored the Germanic roots of European civilization, and the Goths featured prominently in that narrative. Yet this revival was often more myth than fact. Romantic interpretation smoothed over complexities, turning the Goths into symbols of liberty, purity, or loss, depending on the needs of the artist. Still, these visions brought the Goths back into cultural consciousness. Today, the word Gothic is everywhere, in art, literature, architecture, even music. It no longer belongs solely to the tribes who crossed the Danube or sacked Rome. But their spirit, restless, resilient, and remembered, still lingers. Through centuries of forgetting and rediscovery, the Goths remain. A people reborn not in blood, but in imagination. The road we have walked is long. From northern mists to southern suns, from the plains of Dacia to the ruins of Rome, from the royal courts of Toledo to the silent cliffs of Crimea, the Goths wandered, ruled, believed, and vanished. Yet they are not truly gone. Their kingdoms lie buried. Their language is extinct. Their names appear only in books, their laws in fragile manuscripts. But something of them endures, not just in memory, but in the foundations of the world they helped to shape. They were among the first to carry a tribal identity into the heart of empire, and to survive it. They did not merely destroy Rome, they transformed its legacy. They governed by law, not only by strength. They debated faith, not only wielded it. They blended the barbarian and the Roman, the pagan and the Christian, the old and the new. Their churches left arches. Their codes left principles. Their names, Alaric, Theodoric, Rekked, still echo, quiet but strong, through the corridors of European history. And in the broader story of civilization, the Goths remind us of something essential. That history is not made only by those who build empires, but also by those who pass between them. That migration is not chaos, but transformation. That a people can vanish from sight, yet still leave marks on the land, on the law, and on the soul. The Gothic story is one of sorrow and survival, of loss, but also of legacy. It begins in shadow, flares into light, and fades again. But in that arc, it tells the tale not just of a tribe, but of humanity itself, ever searching, ever changing, ever reaching for something beyond. So let us remember them. Not as barbarians at the gate, but as bridge builders, between eras, between peoples, between worlds. The Goths have passed, but their echo endures.